I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to escape the bustle of everyday life with a few good friends. We'd chosen a remote campsite in the English countryside, far away from the usual crowd. The kind of place where the only sounds at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. No one else was supposed to be there, just the four of us, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. The first night was just like I had imagined. We set up our tents, cooked a simple dinner, and sat around the fire, enjoying the quiet. The kind of quiet that fills your ears with ringing, the type you rarely get in the city. I remember how peaceful everything felt. The cool evening breeze, the crackling fire, and the distant hum of nature all around us. After a while, we all headed to our tents and fell asleep without a second thought. The whole world outside seemed to be perfectly still. I woke up suddenly at around 4 a.m. My mind was foggy from sleep, and I could hear the faint sound of movement coming from outside my tent. It wasn't the usual rustling of animals. This was something deliberate. My heart began to race as I tried to shake off the remnants of sleep and listen more closely. The noise was muffled but clear enough to tell that someone was walking near our campsite. Not just walking, there was a deliberate pace to it, like they were trying to be quiet, but not quiet enough. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but then I heard a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against leaves. The sound was getting closer. My breath hitched in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to sneak past us. They were circling the campsite like they were checking it out, as if they knew exactly where we were. Panic hit me like a wave, and I froze, straining to hear any more clues about what was going on. Then, through the fabric of my tent, I saw it. A light. At first, it was small, faint, just a tiny glow moving near the edge of my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that light. My friend Sam had described it to me earlier. He'd been out to the toilet block just after midnight, and he said he had seen a similar light, an LED at head height, moving around like someone was out there, walking in the dark. At first, he thought it might have been another camper, but when he froze to watch it, the light darted off quickly. He said it looked like it was attached to a person's head, but when he looked more closely, there was no one around. He'd come back to the tent in a hurry, and I could see he was rattled. I thought maybe he had been imagining things. I tried to convince myself that maybe it had been a reflection of his headlamp off an animal's eyes or something natural like that. But in that moment, seeing the same kind of light, I wasn't so sure. I could see it clearly now. It was bright, almost yellow in color, and just above my head, just beyond the fabric of the tent. Below it was another light, a darker green one. Both were moving in sync, like someone was standing just outside my tent, looking around, trying to stay hidden. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the realization hit me. This wasn't a reflection. There was definitely someone outside, just inches from me, and they had no idea I was awake. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was lie still and listen as the lights circled the tent. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, and my heart pounded in my chest. There was no cover in the tent, no way to protect myself or to escape without them hearing me. The person was so close that I could hear their breathing, soft but steady. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. The person outside the tent paced back and forth, the faint crunch of leaves underfoot the only noise breaking the stillness. I could see the outline of the lights moving along the edges of the tent, hovering just outside my view. Then there was a brief pause. My whole body tensed, every muscle frozen in place, waiting for the next sound. Would they come closer? Would they notice I was awake? My thoughts raced, and I felt a surge of fear. I had to tell Sam. I had to wake him up, but I couldn't make a sound. The person outside could be listening, waiting for a sign. After what felt like an eternity, I turned to Sam, who was still fast asleep in the adjacent tent. I called his name softly at first, my voice barely a whisper, too afraid to be heard. "Sam," I repeated, a little louder this time. "Sam, wake up." His eyes flickered open. He didn't speak immediately, but I could tell he was alert. "There's someone outside," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I saw the lights, the same ones you saw." Sam didn't hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight, and we both slipped quietly out of the tent. I couldn't stop shaking. My thoughts raced with fear and confusion. What was going on? Who was out there? We stepped carefully around the campsite, our footsteps muffled on the damp ground. The gate creaked as we approached, but no one was there. We swept the area with our flashlights, scanning every tree and bush. The beams of light flicked across the ground, illuminating nothing but shadows. No footprints, no sign of anyone at all. The lights had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. We searched the bushes behind the toilets, where Sam said he'd seen the light the night before. There was some toilet paper caught in a thorn bush, but no other clues. We checked the ground for any signs of movement, any footprints in the mud, but there was nothing. It was as if whoever had been there had just disappeared. We were left standing in the dark, confused and unsettled, our adrenaline starting to fade. The next morning, we walked around again, trying to make sense of what had happened. We looked at the area near the toilet block, searching for any clues. There were no footprints, no obvious signs of anyone moving around. We found the spot where Sam had seen the light, behind some thick brush. It was the perfect place to hide and watch the campsite without being seen. Still, the logical part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe it was just a dormouse or something small with reflective eyes. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. I had seen those lights clearly. I had heard the footsteps, and I had felt the fear. It wasn't just my imagination. That night I was woken again, not by Sam, but by the same faint rustling outside my tent. The sounds were almost identical to the night before. I could hear someone or something moving cautiously around the camp. I checked the time, 4 a.m. again. My heart sank. The same time, the same feeling of dread washed over me. This time, I was determined not to make the same mistake. I stayed absolutely still, holding my breath, waiting for any clue. And then, just like the night before, I saw the lights, a yellow one and beneath it a green one. They were hovering at head height, clearly attached to someone's head. They darted in and out of sight as the person moved around, looking through the campsite. I could see their figure through the tent, pacing back and forth, as if they were waiting for something or someone. I had no doubt now this wasn't just a person. It was the same person from last night. My stomach churned with fear. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. I was terrified that if I did, they would know I was awake. And then what? What were they planning? Why were they here? I woke Sam again, whispering urgently, "He's back." We didn't even need to say anything more. We grabbed our flashlights and crept out of the tent. This time, we heard the gate clang as we stepped out, and I knew the person was gone. The campsite was silent once again. We searched for a while, but found nothing. No one was there. It felt like we were chasing shadows, searching for something that wasn't real, even though we both knew it was. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We sat huddled in the darkness, staring into the woods, but no one came. We waited, listening to the wind, hoping we wouldn't hear the telltale rustling again. By morning, we were all exhausted and on edge. We couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us, that we had been exposed in a way we didn't fully understand. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the site behind us. As we drove away, the distant woods seemed to close in on us, a reminder of the unease we'd felt in that remote, isolated place. I don't think I'll ever go camping again. Not like that. There's something unsettling about being so far from the world, so vulnerable to whatever might be lurking in the dark. All the times I thought I heard something but dismissed it as the wind now seemed like a warning I didn't heed. Maybe I was just lucky nothing happened, or maybe we just weren't the target. Either way, it's a trip I'll never forget. I still hear the rustling sometimes when I'm alone at night, and I wonder who was out there, watching us. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they meant us no harm, but I'll never be sure. I used to go camping pretty often, especially during my early 20s. It was a cheap way to get away from everything for a while. No reception, no work, no noise except the woods and the fire crackling. Most of the time, it was peaceful. sometimes boring even. A lot of sitting around, eating, hiking a bit, maybe drinking a couple beers if we brought any. Just being out there, getting some space from the usual crap back home. Never had anything that really got under my skin. This one trip was supposed to be like that. Nothing special. Me and my buddy Alex had gone out to a place we'd camped a few times before. It wasn't a formal campsite, not with toilets and picnic tables or anything like that. Just a clearing off a narrow dirt road deep in one of the state parks. Big enough for a couple tents and a truck to park. There was a fire pit someone had made with old rocks and metal bits stuck in the ground. I think people had been camping there for years. It was late September. The air was just starting to get cool at night, which I liked. Fewer bugs, better sleep. I brought my usual stuff: tent, sleeping bag, folding chair, a cooler with some food, a little propane stove, lanterns, and the usual tools. Alex drove up in his truck, an old dark blue Chevy that ran like crap but never seemed to die. He had his tent, sleeping bag, and more food, so we figured we were set. We arrived maybe around 5:30 p.m. Sun was low but not close to setting. Took us about half an hour to set up both our tents, gather up some firewood from around the site, and get the food out. That night we grilled some sausages and made instant mac and cheese. Nothing fancy. We ate, sat by the fire, and talked for a while. I think we went to bed around 11 or so. Here's the thing, I didn't drink that night. Neither did Alex. I remember that clearly because we were both trying to take a break from it after a rough weekend before. So we had water and soda, nothing that would mess with our heads or make things hazy the next morning. I was sharing the tent with Alex. His tent was a little bigger than mine, so we just brought both our sleeping bags into his to save space. It was a tight fit, but manageable. There's something about sleeping outside that usually knocks me out. Maybe it's the fresh air, or maybe it's just the absence of distractions. Either way, I tend to sleep heavy when I camp. That night was different. I don't know exactly what time it happened. I had this dream, and it felt unusually vivid. In the dream, I was asleep in the tent, just like in real life. It wasn't one of those dreams where things are strange or blurry. Felt like I was exactly where I was. I could hear the wind through the trees, the faint rustle of leaves outside, even the occasional creak of the tent fabric shifting. Then I heard something walking outside. It wasn't running or stomping, just soft, deliberate steps in the leaves. Not a squirrel or raccoon sort of sound. Something heavier. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but deer usually move quicker and more nervously. Whatever this was, it was slow, careful. I remember focusing all my attention on the sound, trying to figure out whether it was a person or some kind of animal. It was right outside the tent, circling slowly. The footsteps paused every few seconds, like it was stopping to listen. That part hit me hard. It felt like whatever was out there was listening for something. As I was concentrating on that sound, something pressed up against the side of the tent, right next to my head. It wasn't fast or aggressive, just this firm pressure against the canvas wall. Not a hand exactly, but broad and solid, like someone leaning in. I flinched back immediately, trying to get away from it. My heart was pounding in my chest. I felt this wave of cold run through me. Then I woke up, just like that. It was morning. Sunlight was coming through the tent walls, giving everything that soft yellow glow. I could hear birds. No sound of movement or anything weird. I sat up slowly, still caught in that dream feeling. My heart was still going pretty fast, and my back was damp with sweat. Alex was already stirring next to me. He looked groggy, but as I sat up, he did too. I don't remember saying anything right away, but I noticed he looked unsettled. We both sat there for a while in silence, like we were waiting to shake off the night. Eventually, I told him about the dream, the footsteps, the pressure on the tent, every detail. He went still. Then he looked at me with this weird look on his face. Not scared exactly, but tight, like someone who's hearing something they weren't expecting to match what they already know. Then he said he'd had the exact same dream. The footsteps, the pressure on the tent wall, the sense that something was outside listening. He even said it pressed against the tent near his head. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at him. He looked pale, like he hadn't slept well. It wasn't just a similar dream, it was the same one. and neither of us had said a word about it the night before. We hadn't been drinking. We hadn't told scary stories. Nothing like that. We sat in silence for a while, then started getting dressed. We unzipped the tent, still not talking much, and stepped out. That's when we saw it. His truck was wide open. All 4 doors. Driver side, passenger side, back seats. Every door was hanging open like someone had come through during the night and rifled through it. Nothing had been stolen as far as we could tell, but things had been moved around. A water bottle was on the ground. A jacket that had been on the front seat was in the back. The glove box was open. Neither of us had touched the truck since the night before. I remember watching Alex lock it when we crawled into the tent. He always double checks his truck. It's just a thing he does. No chance we left it like that. We looked around the campsite. No tracks, no signs of people. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, but nothing looked disturbed except the truck. It's hard to describe the feeling we both had. Like the air had gone stale. It was still quiet out there, just the morning birds and wind, but it felt wrong. Like the woods were too quiet now that we noticed the truck. Neither of us said anything, but we packed up fast. We didn't even eat breakfast. Just shoved everything in the back of the truck and got out of there. The ride back was quiet. A few words here and there, mostly about the dream. We kept trying to explain it, like maybe we'd overheard something the night before and our brains made it into a dream. But we hadn't heard anything weird, and we hadn't even been asleep for that long before it happened. It wasn't sleep paralysis. We could both move. It wasn't night terrors. We weren't hallucinating. It stuck with me for days after. I kept trying to rationalize it. I told a few people about it when I got back. Some of them just shrugged it off, but a few of them, people who had camped in that same area before, started telling me things they'd seen or heard there. Stuff they couldn't explain. One guy said he saw someone standing at the edge of his firelight once. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. Another girl said she woke up to find her cooler open and all her food laid out on a rock in a neat little row. Like someone had organized it on purpose. Always little things. Nothing that screamed danger, but just off. I never went back to that spot again. Alex didn't either. We went on other trips after that, but always to new places. Places where nothing had happened before. That one night still bothers me. Not because of what happened exactly, but because there's no good explanation. We weren't drunk. We weren't scared before we went to sleep. We didn't talk about anything weird. We just had the exact same dream at the exact same time, and then found the truck open like someone or something had been there. The worst part is that it didn't feel evil or threatening. Not exactly. Felt curious. Like something came close enough to press up against us, close enough to open the truck and look around. But it didn't take anything. It didn't hurt us. It just watched. That quiet kind of interest, whatever it was, feels worse than if it had been something loud or violent. Something watching, listening, moving carefully and slowly just outside the tent, close enough to touch. I still go camping sometimes, but not alone, and not without checking that the tent is zip tight and the car is locked. Every time I wake up in a tent now, I wait a few seconds to listen, just in case. And I always park with the truck facing the road, just in case we need to leave fast. I was backpacking through Colorado with a friend in the early 70s, just a couple of teenagers on an adventure in the mountains. We had a small transistor radio with us, the kind that ran on batteries, and it was one of those late evenings when you feel the excitement of being in the woods, far away from home. We had been at a trailhead near the road, right on the edge of the wilderness, but not far enough to feel isolated. Our plan was to camp here overnight before starting our hike the next day. It was just us and the sound of the creek nearby, the kind of silence that fills your ears in the woods. The news bulletin on the radio stopped me cold. The announcer's voice was calm, but the words made my blood run cold. There had been a murder, 2 separate attacks on campers, the same brutal method. A man with an axe. He had attacked them in their sleeping bags. Just the thought of it made me shiver, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It was hard to focus after that. My mind kept drifting back to the chilling image of someone with an axe, hacking away at people while they slept. We both tried to shake it off, thinking it was probably just a freak occurrence, some random madman out there. But something in the air felt different. The normal peacefulness of the woods had turned into an unnerving stillness. I tried not to think about it as we set up our camp, but the tension was thick, and every small sound seemed to get magnified. The rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, even the sound of the creek running by, all of it seemed to be wrapped in an eerie, unnatural quiet. The night crept in slowly, the stars starting to blink to life as the sky darkened. We were on edge but didn't say anything to each other, trying to act normal, even though the whole situation felt far from it. We lay down in our sleeping bags, no tent between us and the night, just the stars overhead and the sounds of the forest surrounding us. The fire crackled low in the distance, and the warmth from the embers barely reached us in the cool mountain air. Then we heard it. Car engine. It wasn't close, but it was definitely there. It had that low, rumbling sound of something coming down the road, faint at first, but gradually getting louder. The headlights cut through the darkness like a distant torch, passing just a little over 100 feet away, across the creek from us. The light moved in a slow arc, and for a moment, I thought it might come right up to us. But it didn't. It just passed, moving down the road, the headlights fading as it continued on its way. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. We both looked at each other for a split second, eyes wide, but it seemed okay. The car had gone by. We weren't being followed. But then, just as we were about to settle back into our bags, the sound of a car engine came again. Only this time it was different. There were no headlights. It was eerie, the kind of thing that sends your instincts into overdrive. The car had stopped, right there, across the creek. We couldn't see it, couldn't hear anything other than the soft sounds of the woods, the wind and water, but the presence of it was undeniable. Without a word, we both sat up in our sleeping bags, quickly scanning our surroundings. There was no discussion needed. We both knew what we had to do. There was a quiet understanding between us. We stuffed a few things into our bags, trying to make it look like we were just regular campers who had decided to turn in for the night. Then we quickly built up the fire again, tossing a few branches on the embers to give the illusion that we were still awake and alert. The silence felt like it was stretching into eternity. We didn't speak, but I could feel the tension thick in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline already coursing through my veins, making everything feel sharper, more immediate. The world seemed to narrow down to the space between us and that car. We had our bush knife and hatchet with us, tools we carried for camping and safety, but they felt useless in the face of whatever threat might be out there. I had no idea who was in that car, or if it even was a person. The news story kept playing over and over in my head. The image of an axe wielded in the dark, hacking at someone helpless in their sleep. Couldn't shake it. We waited and waited. The car didn't move, the sound of the engine went still. It was as though time itself had frozen. The only noise was the constant murmur of the creek, and every now and then, the rustle of wind through the trees. My senses were on high alert. I could hear every snap of a twig, every flutter of a bird's wings, but no car engine, no movement, nothing. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath. The minutes stretched on for what seemed like hours, but I know it was only about 45 minutes before the sound of the car's engine finally hummed to life again. The headlights came on suddenly, blindingly bright, and for a moment, I could make out the silhouette of the car sitting there, facing us across the creek. It didn't move at first, but then the engine revved, and the car began to pull away, slowly rolling down the road in the opposite direction. I sat there, watching until the last sound of the tires faded away, until everything once again went silent. The air was thick with relief, but it wasn't complete. The fear, the unease, still lingered in my chest. We had stayed hidden in the rocks, barely breathing for almost an hour. I don't think either of us felt safe, but at least we hadn't been discovered, at least we hadn't been attacked. After the car left, we were both too wired to sleep. The adrenaline had left us tense, our hearts still pounding from the unexpected encounter. It was far too late to try to get any rest now, and after talking for a while about whether or not we should leave, we decided to break camp. It was nearly midnight, but we didn't want to stay in that spot any longer. We packed up quickly, gathering everything in silence. The fire was out now, just a few glowing embers left, and the world around us felt far too quiet. We decided to hike a few miles in, not far, but just enough to put more distance between us and that creepy stop across the creek. The dark trail seemed endless, the sounds of the night pressing in on us from all sides. We moved quickly, even though the darkness was thick and the mountain terrain was rough. But we had to keep moving. We found a concealed spot in a patch of brush, hidden enough that no one would find us unless they were really looking. We threw down our sleeping bags and lay in the dark, still too wired to sleep properly. I kept thinking about that car, about the axe-wielding killer, about the strange silence that had followed the car stopping. It was a long night, filled with strange thoughts, but by the time the first light of dawn started to break, we were both exhausted. The sun crept over the horizon, and we finally let ourselves rest for a few hours, not in a regular campground but tucked away in the brush. The day passed quietly after that, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of what might have happened if we hadn't taken action. If we had stayed in our sleeping bags like nothing was wrong. I never found out whether they caught the man who attacked those campers, or whether he went on to do worse. All I knew was that something in my gut told me we had been lucky that night. It was a relief when we finally made it back to civilization. The road was in sight, and I could almost feel the safety of it, the familiarity of people, and the knowledge that we were no longer alone out there in the wilderness. The radio had long since stopped broadcasting any updates, but I didn't need to hear anything more. What we had experienced was real, and it was enough to remind me of just how quickly things can turn from peaceful to terrifying when you're out in the wild, relying on nothing but your instincts to keep you safe. I never went back to that trailhead, never camped near a road without a tent again, and every time I hear about a similar story of a murderer on the loose, I can't help but remember that night. The dark, the silence, and the knowledge that danger can be closer than you think, just beyond the trees, waiting. I had been camping before, but it had always been easy, relaxed trips with car camping and minimal effort. I'd never really thought about how hard backpacking could be, or how easy it was to get yourself into situations you couldn't just drive away from. This trip was supposed to be a weekend adventure with my boyfriend, a way to get out of the city and into nature for a while. It was supposed to be fun, simple, until it wasn't. The trouble started before we even got to the trailhead. The parking lot the map said we needed to find didn't exist. We drove around the mountain for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of the map. The only real directions were from an online guide, which was almost useless. It didn't match the terrain, and the roads weren't marked clearly. At some point, we ended up driving all the way to the top of the mountain, the last place on the map where the parking was supposed to be. Finally, we found it. We parked the car at the top, gathered our stuff, and started our descent. The plan was to walk down the mountain, set up camp, and then hike back up the next day. Nothing too complicated. But when you're not prepared, or you don't really know what you're doing, things can go wrong pretty quickly. About an hour into our hike, we came across a man sitting on the side of the trail, cooking something on a small, cheap gas stove. He seemed harmless enough at first, just an odd guy out there in the woods, cooking by himself. But then he started talking. He asked if we knew where we were or if we could point him toward a certain place on the mountain. He said he was parked somewhere but didn't seem entirely sure of where, then started changing his story. First it was point A, then point B, and then another place altogether. It didn't make much sense. He said his friend had dropped him off and was going to pick him up at some point further down the trail. Then he mentioned a third friend who had gone back to the car to wait. All of it was disjointed and didn't add up. First, I didn't think much of it. People get confused out in the woods, I figured. But then, I noticed something off. He didn't look like he was all there. His eyes were glassy, and there was something about the way he moved, slow and almost sluggish. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about him seemed strange. We exchanged a few more words before we decided to move on. It wasn't worth staying there, so we said goodbye and continued down the trail. The trail wasn't easy to follow. It was poorly marked, and the maps we had didn't help much either. We ended up wandering a bit, unsure if we were still on the right path. After a while, we found ourselves on a horse trail with no signs or markers to guide us. It felt like we were making things up as we went along. We walked for a while longer, and when the sun started to dip low, we decided it was time to find a place to camp. We were both tired, and it was getting late. But just when we thought we had found a spot, we realized the trail was blocked on both sides by barbed wire. There was no way to camp there. We kept walking, looking for another place, and eventually stumbled upon a huge puddle in the middle of the trail. At this point, it was nearly dark, and we were both exhausted. So we turned around, figuring we'd head back to the point where the trail turned into the horse trail. Felt like the safest bet. That's when we saw him again, the man we had passed earlier. He was still on the same path, but now he was walking behind us only about 20 feet back. We were both uncomfortable, but we tried to shake it off. He was still talking, but his words didn't make much sense. He mentioned something about having heavy narcotics with him, fentanyl, and another one I didn't recognize. That's when I started to get really worried. Something wasn't right. He wasn't acting like someone who was just out for a hike. He wasn't just a lost camper. There was a danger in the air, something about him that made my skin crawl. Without saying anything to each other, my boyfriend and I made the decision to leave. We couldn't take any chances. We turned around and started sprinting up the mountain, desperate to get back to the car. We had about 6 miles to go, and the sun had nearly set. The air was cooling down, but we were still sweating from the heat and the effort. We had plenty of water, but it was so hot, and we were practically running up the trail, trying to get as far away as possible. The climb was brutal. I had never hiked that fast, and certainly never with a weighty pack on my back. My body was struggling to keep up. The ground was steep, and every step felt harder than the last. My legs burned, and I could feel myself getting more and more dehydrated as I pushed myself faster and faster. It felt like the whole mountain was fighting me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my head started spinning. I tried to keep pace with my boyfriend, but it was impossible. Every few minutes, I had to stop, bend over, and catch my breath. I could feel the heat from the sun still radiating from the rocks beneath me, and I just wanted to stop and sit down, but I knew we couldn't. We had to get back to the car. We had no choice. Time seemed to stretch on forever as we made our way up, step by agonizing step. I was starting to feel like I was going to collapse, and my mouth was bone dry. My body screamed for water, but there was none left. We still had a ways to go. Every time I glanced up, the trail stretched further ahead, and I could see the parking lot still far off in the distance. I don't know how long it took, but when we finally reached the top, I was almost too exhausted to move. My boyfriend suggested I wait on a bench near the parking lot while he went to get the car. I was too tired to argue, so I sat down, feeling the sweat on my face dry in the cool air. I watched him disappear around a corner, and for a moment, I just sat there, unable to move. The exhaustion had sunk into my bones. It felt like my body had just given up. My head was pounding, and I could barely keep my eyes open. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound of the car coming down the mountain, and soon enough, he was pulling up to where I was sitting. He helped me into the car, and I sank into the seat, not caring about anything except the cool air inside. We drove out of the park, both of us silent, trying to process what had just happened. I wasn't sure how to feel. The adrenaline from running so hard had worn off, and I was left with an overwhelming sense of relief. But then, just as we were leaving the park, we saw a sign. It was small, faded, but unmistakable. Hitchhikers maybe escaped convicts. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. The man we had seen on the trail, the one who had been acting so strange, was he one of them? Had we just narrowly escaped something far worse than getting lost? My mind raced, replaying the entire encounter. If we had stayed even a minute longer, if we had made a wrong turn on the trail, would things have gone differently? I still don't know for sure, but I do know that I won't be going backpacking like that again anytime soon. Not without knowing exactly where I'm going, and not without a little more preparation. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept seeing the man's face in my mind, and the way he had looked at us, like he knew something we didn't, something dangerous. I thought about the warning sign as we drove away. I tried to convince myself it was just a precaution, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had felt the danger, and it was real, and I'll never forget that feeling of almost being trapped out there, with no way out, and no one to help us but ourselves. We were about 10 or 11 years old when we lived in a small campsite in the middle of the deep woods. Our family didn't have much, but we had everything we needed. Our parents had an old camp trailer, which they used for cooking and as a base of operations. It wasn't much, but it was all we needed. There was no electricity. We lived off the grid like a lot of people in those parts. We used a gas stove to cook most of our meals, but a lot of the time we just cooked over the fire, using firewood that Dad would chop down in the woods around the camp. My brother and I had our own place to sleep at night. It wasn't a tent, but it wasn't quite a cabin either. It was more like a cave. It was the camper shell from my father's old pickup truck, which he dragged out into the woods and placed over a hole dug into the side of a small mountain. The hole had been dug out by hand, with the ground soft enough that you could carve it out without much difficulty. The camper shell was placed over it, and it made a pretty decent place to sleep. We didn't have any mattresses or anything like that, but we had blankets, sleeping bags, and the soft dirt beneath us. It was simple, but it worked for us. The only light we had at night was from a couple of kerosene lamps, but they didn't do much to brighten up the space. The real light came from the fire outside, where we'd sit and talk at night, listening to the sounds of the forest. The deep woods had its own unique sounds. You'd get used to it. The wind would blow through the trees, making the leaves rustle. You'd hear the calls of owls or the occasional sound of something walking through the underbrush. Deer were common, and every so often, an elk would wander past the edge of our camp. The wolves were out there too, and sometimes you'd hear their howls echoing through the night. We knew bears were around as well, though they usually kept to themselves. That's what life was like for us year-round. We were part of nature in a way that most kids today would never understand. But there was something that happened one year that I can't explain. It's not something you hear about in stories or see in movies. It's one of those things that, no matter how much you try to convince yourself it wasn't real, the memory of it is still there, nagging at you. It started a few nights after we'd gotten settled into camp. My brother and I had been sleeping in the camper shell as usual. The nights were usually quiet, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves. We had our little routine, getting ready for bed, talking about whatever we'd done that day, and then falling asleep under the stars. But then, one night, something changed. I woke up suddenly. I don't know if it was the sound of something outside or if it was just some strange feeling in the air. Either way, I was awake. I looked over at my brother, who was still asleep, breathing quietly. The silence around us was broken by a sound that cut through the night like a knife. At first, I thought it was an animal. Maybe an elk, I thought. They make all sorts of strange sounds sometimes. But no, this was different. It wasn't a grunt or a low moan or a howl. It was a scream. I froze, listening. The scream came again, louder this time. It wasn't the cry of any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded like a baby, like a child screaming in absolute terror, the kind of scream that would stop your heart. But it wasn't just a baby's cry. It was wrong. There was something about it that didn't sit right, like it was too loud, too forceful. It felt as though it was coming from everywhere at once. From the trees, from the ground, from the sky. The scream repeated, again and again, each one louder than the last. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard. It didn't sound like a cougar or an elk or a wolf. It didn't sound like anything I had ever encountered before. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding. I turned to look at my brother, still asleep beside me. I wanted to wake him up, but I was frozen. There was something about that sound that made it hard to think. It was like a primal fear had taken over, and all I could do was listen. The scream faded for a moment, and then it returned, even louder this time. It was as if it was coming closer, as though something was circling around us, getting closer with each scream. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. What could make a sound like that? What kind of animal would scream like a baby in the dead of night? I glanced around, trying to see through the darkness outside. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only the faint glow of embers in the distance. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything except for the scream, which echoed in my ears and seemed to reverberate through the earth itself. After what felt like an eternity, the sound faded, then stopped completely. For a long moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart in my chest. The woods were silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, an unnerving kind of silence, one that felt like something was watching us. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, neither did my brother. We just lay there, staring out into the darkness, listening for anything that might break the silence. But the scream didn't come again that night. The next few nights were the same. Each night, that terrifying scream would pierce the quiet of the forest. It was the same sound, each time loud and shrill. It wasn't a simple animal noise. It wasn't the cry of a wolf, a cougar, or any other animal we knew. It was something different, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I heard it. We told our parents about it, but they didn't seem too concerned. Dad said it was probably a cougar. Mom said it could be an elk or maybe an opossum, but it didn't sound like any of those things. The noise was too human, too unnatural. It was loud enough to shake you to your core. Each night, the screams would come from a different direction. Sometimes they sounded distant, like they were coming from the far side of the mountain. Other times, they seemed to be right outside the camper shell, as though something was standing just beyond the trees, screaming into the night. It went on for 4 or 5 nights, and each night it got harder to sleep. The fear of the unknown, of not knowing what was making that sound, gnawed at us. Whatever it wasn't something we were familiar with. It wasn't an animal we could identify. It wasn't anything we could explain. Then, just like that, the screams stopped. We woke up one morning to find that the night had passed without any of the terrible sounds. It was like the forest had returned to normal. No strange cries, no distant echoes of terror. Just the quiet sounds of the woods that we were used to. We never found out what caused the screams. We never heard it again. Maybe it was a cougar, like my dad said, or maybe it was something else entirely. I'll never know, but I've never forgotten that sound. The sound of a baby's scream, echoing through the deep woods in the dead of night, from all around us. A sound that will haunt me forever. I had been skiing all morning on a quiet trail that looped through the mountain. It was one of those rare, cold days when everything was perfect, the kind of clear blue sky where you could see for miles, and the snow was packed just right for skiing. The slopes were mostly empty, which was fine by me. I was on my own, enjoying the freedom of carving my way through the untouched powder, feeling the crisp air whip against my face. The mountain was peaceful, and I felt like I was the only person in the world. After a while, I decided it was time to take a break. I was 16 at the time, not yet old enough to fully grasp the dangers of being alone in the wild, but I didn't think twice about it back then. I skied down a little hill to a spot I had noticed earlier, a small clearing with a large solitary tree. It seemed like the perfect place to sit down and take a rest. I took off my skis, buried them in the snow to keep them from getting buried under a new layer, and stuck the bottom of one of my poles into the snow so I could find them easily when I was done. I wasn't too worried about them being stolen. This was a secluded trail, and I hadn't seen anyone around for hours. The view from where I was sitting was breathtaking. The clouds were below me, forming a soft, white blanket over the valley. The mountains were sharp and towering, casting long shadows across the snow. The only sound was the wind and the occasional gust of air that rustled through the trees. It was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred, isolated from the rest of the world. I pulled out my ham sandwich from my pack and took a bite, feeling the cold air in my lungs as I chewed. I was so relaxed, so content. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until I started eating. The sandwich was simple, just a couple of slices of ham and some bread, but it tasted better than anything I could remember. I lit a cigarette afterward, leaning back against the tree and letting the smoke curl around me. The cigarette wasn't something I did often, but it was one of those little indulgences I allowed myself when I was up in the mountains, far away from anyone who would judge me. The smoke twisted up into the air, mixing with the cold mountain air, and for a moment, I felt like I could just stay there forever. The feeling of solitude and peace was all-encompassing. I couldn't hear anything except the soft whispers of the wind. It was as if time had slowed down, and all my worries had been left behind on the other side of the mountain. I lost track of how much time had passed, but after about 30 minutes, I decided it was time to head back to my skis. I stood up, brushing the snow off my pants, and turned to walk back toward where I had buried them. The hike wasn't far, maybe 25 feet or so, just down a small incline and around a cluster of rocks. It didn't take long for me to reach the spot, but when I got there, my heart dropped. The snow around my skis was covered in huge, deep tracks that were far too large to be made by anything other than a mountain lion. The prints were unmistakable. They were fresh, too, probably made just minutes before I returned. My stomach twisted, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I'd heard about mountain lions before, of course. I knew they roamed the area, but I hadn't expected to come across one, let alone find that it had been so close to where I had just been sitting. I felt stupid for not being more cautious. I had been so absorbed in the peace and beauty of the mountain that I hadn't even considered that something might be nearby, something that could be watching me. The tracks circled around my skis, as if the cougar had been sniffing them. It didn't take much to guess what had attracted it. My ham sandwich. I had left a trace of scent in the air, a trail that probably led straight to where I was sitting. I could almost imagine it, the mountain lion creeping silently through the snow, its paws leaving barely a mark as it stalked the smell of food. I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the prints. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Had the cougar been close by when I was sitting there eating? How long had it been watching me? I shuddered, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. I had been totally unaware, completely vulnerable. I had no way of defending myself. A mountain lion could have easily attacked me, and I wouldn't have stood a chance. I thought back to all the times I had seen the posters in the ski lodge about cougar sightings, the warnings about how dangerous they could be if you weren't careful. But they always made it seem so distant, something that happened to someone else on some other trail, far away from where I was. But here I was, standing next to my skis, alone on a secluded part of the mountain, surrounded by tracks from a creature that could kill me in seconds. I wasn't sure what I should do. My mind raced through all the things I'd heard about dealing with mountain lions. Make yourself look bigger, make noise, slowly back away. But all of that seemed useless now. The tracks were all around me, and I had no idea where the lion might be. Could be just beyond the tree line, watching me from the shadows. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. The last thing I wanted to do was panic. I slowly backed away from the skis, my eyes scanning the trees around me. I didn't make any sudden movements, but I couldn't help but feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Every snap of a twig or rustle of a branch made my heart race. I kept my eyes on the tracks, on the trees, on everything, waiting for a flash of movement, a sign that the cougar was closing in. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a point where I felt far enough away from the skis to safely turn around. I didn't waste any time. I moved quickly, picking up my pace as I skied down the trail. I didn't look back, not even once. Every part of me was focused on getting away, putting as much distance between myself and the mountain lion as possible. The slope I was on was steep, but I was careful, concentrating on every movement. My heart was still pounding, and my breath came in quick, shallow gasps. I didn't slow down until I reached the ski lodge, where people were milling around, getting ready to head back out for their own runs. I could feel the tension in my body begin to loosen, but I didn't let myself relax completely. The thought of the cougar and the tracks I had found stayed with me as I made my way inside. When I finally sat down at a table and ordered a hot chocolate, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. The lodge was warm, and the sound of people chatting and the clinking of cups felt like a barrier between me and the mountain, keeping me safe. But the memory of those tracks, of the realization that I had been so close to danger without even knowing it, stayed with me. I never skied on that trail again. I stuck to more populated areas, where the risk of encountering a mountain lion seemed lower. I learned to appreciate the beauty of the mountains from a distance, respecting the wildness of the place, but never letting my guard down again. And I never ate lunch in a secluded spot like that again. From that day on, I made sure to stay closer to the lodge, surrounded by people, where I could see and be seen. Looking back, I know how lucky I was. A few minutes later, and things could have gone very differently. The thought of what could have happened, of how quickly things could have escalated, still sends a chill down my spine. But I made it out and I learned my lesson. Respect the mountain and always stay aware. You never know when you're going to come face to face with something far more dangerous than you expect. It was about 10 years ago, and we decided to go camping in a spot that was supposed to offer some peace and quiet, a kind of escape from the noise of the city. We arrived at the campsite around 4 p.m., the sun still hanging high in the sky. The place wasn't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't too close to any kind of busy road either. It had the feel of a countryside getaway, which is what we were looking for. There were other people who had set up camp before us, but they seemed to be packing up around the time we arrived, so we had the site mostly to ourselves after that. First, it felt perfect. We had all the gear: tents, coolers, camp stoves, everything you could need for a comfortable, if not luxurious, camping experience. We were those city kids, the ones who had more professional, relatively expensive camping equipment compared to the usual campers you'd see. We had our tents up by 4:30 p.m., everything neatly organized, and our fire pit ready to go. We were just about to settle in and relax when the neighbors left, around 6 p.m. As their car pulled away, the place became eerily quiet. We were alone now, surrounded by nature, and the calmness was exactly what we were looking for. For the first few hours, we enjoyed the serenity. But around the same time, we started hearing something strange. It was faint at first, a distant sound of laughter echoing through the trees. It was the kind of laughter you hear from kids, light and carefree. We assumed it was the children from the nearby campsite, still playing somewhere in the woods. After all, the whole area wasn't isolated, and kids are bound to run around while their parents cook or set up camp. The laughter continued off and on, as though the kids were hiding behind trees or playing games in the woods. But it wasn't close enough for us to worry. We didn't think much of it. As the sun dipped lower and lower in the sky, we carried on with our usual camp activities. We cooked our dinner, joked around, and talked. It wasn't until the sun set completely, around 8 p.m., that things started to feel off. The temperature dropped quickly, and the last bit of daylight faded into pitch darkness. We didn't have much moonlight that night. In fact, I don't remember the moon being visible at all. The only light we had came from our campfire, the orange glow casting long shadows across our campsite. We were all gathered around the fire, eating and chatting, when we noticed the laughter again. This time it sounded closer, much closer. First, we brushed it off. Probably the kids from the next campsite. We thought, even though it didn't seem to be coming from that direction anymore. We kept hearing the laughter, but it was no longer coming from just one spot. It seemed to be coming from multiple locations all around us. I remember looking around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was hard to tell. It was like the sound was bouncing off the trees, making it hard to know which direction it was coming from. The laughter kept getting closer, started to sound more chaotic. I can't really explain it, but it was like the laughter was no longer playful. It became distorted, almost mocking. Then, everything went completely silent for a moment. That silence didn't last long. It was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold. Rustling. Something moving in the bushes. Something was definitely out there. And then, suddenly, the first glowing yellow eyes appeared. I don't know how to explain it, but there they were, just glowing in the dark, hovering at the edge of the firelight. First, it was one pair, then two. And then, in the blink of an eye, the entire campsite seemed to be surrounded by them. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me as I realized we were not alone. I think we all froze at first, not fully understanding what we were seeing. The eyes weren't just reflective. They were glowing, an eerie yellow that pierced the darkness. I remember the strange glow from those eyes looking back at us. They weren't from a human, that was obvious, but for a second, I couldn't place what kind of animal it could be. It was too dark to make out the bodies of whatever was behind those eyes. But there were too many of them, more than I could count. There were easily 20, maybe more. And then I heard it again, that eerie laughter. It wasn't the sound of children anymore. It was much deeper, more guttural, almost like a cackle. It was coming from all around us, getting louder and louder. I glanced around, and that's when I realized what was happening. We were surrounded by hyenas. I'd never seen hyenas in the wild before, but I knew that laugh anywhere. That distinctive, unsettling, cackling sound. My heart started pounding in my chest as the reality set in. We were surrounded by a pack of hyenas. In that moment, everything I had ever known about camping seemed irrelevant. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My instinct was to run, but I knew better. Hyenas are fast. If we ran, we'd be nothing more than prey. We grabbed whatever we could to defend ourselves. Sticks, rocks, anything that might help. We threw more wood on the fire, making the flames leap higher. The firelight flickered and danced, casting long, trembling shadows. But the glowing eyes didn't move. They were still there, circling us like predators, waiting for the right moment. The laughter started to grow more frantic, like they were getting impatient, almost as if they were taunting us. In a moment of pure panic, one of us, maybe it was me, maybe it was someone else, suggested that we get to the cars. Without a word, we all scrambled to our vehicles, tripping over branches and rocks as we ran. The hyenas were still there, their eyes following our every move, their laughter echoing louder as we made our way to the cars. We got to the cars, quickly turned on the headlights, and honked the horns a couple of times. I don't know if it was the noise or the light, but within moments, the glowing eyes started to disappear. One by one, the hyenas backed away, retreating into the shadows of the woods. We didn't move from the cars for a while, just sitting there, trying to calm our racing hearts. The laughter stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful silence we had originally wanted. It was the kind of silence that felt unnerving after what we had just experienced. After what felt like an eternity, we finally dared to get out of the cars and return to the campsite. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, and the place felt cold and empty. There was no sign of the hyenas. It was as if they had never been there. But I knew what we had seen, what we had heard. That night, we packed up and decided to leave. There was no way we were staying there after that. We had come for peace and serenity, but what we got instead was something far more terrifying. We drove off in silence, the headlights casting long shadows on the trees as we left that campsite behind. It's one of the scariest experiences I've ever had, and to this day, I can't forget those glowing yellow eyes circling us in the dark. We survived, yes, but I don't think any of us would ever look at camping the same way again. That night, I learned just how quickly the peaceful outdoors can turn into something far more dangerous. And every time I go camping now, I'm always more aware of my surroundings, always on alert, because out there, in the dark, you never know what's watching you. Camping was something my family did every summer when I was growing up. It wasn't a question of if we were going, just a matter of where. We'd load up the car with tents, tarps, coolers, food bins, sleeping bags, and whatever else my parents decided we needed that year. Sometimes it was Virginia Beach, sometimes Westmoreland, which I always dreaded. It had these swampy parts, bugs the size of your thumb, and it just smelled like hot plastic and mildew all the time. But then there was Assateague, which was a different kind of wild. You had the beach, the breeze, the salty air, and the ponies. Real, actual wild ponies. That summer, I think I was maybe around 9 or 10. Old enough to understand what was going on, but still young enough that things could easily scare me if they caught me off guard. We got to the campground in Assateague sometime in the afternoon. The sun was still high, the wind kicking up little bursts of sand in the parking lot. You could smell the sea even before you could see it. And I remember feeling excited when we parked the car and started unpacking. It was hot, humid, but the kind of heat that comes with a breeze that almost makes it feel like a reward. You sweat, but then the wind hits you and you think, yeah, this isn't too bad. We picked a campsite that was closer to the beach than usual. My parents liked hearing the waves at night, and I liked that you didn't have to walk as far to get to the water. There was a little dune just past our site, and from the top, you could see the ocean stretching out, endless and gray-blue, with sunlight flashing off the surface like broken glass. We brought 2 tents that year, a larger dome tent for my parents and me, and a smaller one for extra storage or changing clothes, or sometimes my older cousin if he came with us. But that trip, it was just the 3 of us. We set up the main tent closer to the trees and the smaller one maybe 30 or 40 feet away, near where the sandy path dipped toward the beach. The day was pretty uneventful. We grilled hot dogs, ate chips, and got sand in everything. I ran up and down the beach, chased a few crabs, and tried to skim stones into the waves even though the surf always swallowed them before I could tell if I was doing it right. The sun eventually dropped behind the dunes and turned everything golden for about 10 minutes before the sky started going purple and then dark. Campfires flickered around the other sites, and the air filled with the sound of wood crackling, people laughing, bugs buzzing. At night, the beach gets quiet. There's this stillness to it that's only broken by the wind and the waves. You don't get city noise out there. No cars, no phones, just nature doing its thing. That night, I remember the fire dying down slowly. My dad poked at the coals with a stick while my mom packed away what food was left. Then we turned in. I fell asleep to the sound of waves and the faint rustling of the wind tugging at the tent's rainfly. The fabric swayed gently in and out, like the whole thing was breathing. It felt safe, like being wrapped in a soft, warm bag. I always liked sleeping in the tent, even when it got cold, because it felt like a little house just for us. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark, the kind of deep, middle-of-the-night dark that feels heavier than just the absence of light. The moon must have been out, though, because I could see shapes and shadows inside the tent. At first, I wasn't sure what woke me. Everything was still. I didn't hear anything obvious. No crack of branches, no footsteps, nothing that would normally pull someone out of sleep. But I was awake, and I felt that creeping sense that something was just a little bit off. It took me a second to realize my mom was sitting up. Her sleeping bag was pulled back, and she was completely still, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't shaking me or talking, just sitting there staring. That's when I noticed her head was turned toward the mesh window of the tent. I followed her gaze and saw it too. There was a figure outside, right up against the tent wall, just on the other side of the mesh, maybe a foot away from where we were sleeping. It looked like a woman, an old woman, thin, with long hair that moved slightly in the breeze, almost like it was floating. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline in the moonlight. Her posture was bent slightly forward, like she was leaning in to see inside. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat and just sat there, thudding hard. I felt cold even though it was warm in the tent. I didn't know what I was looking at, but everything about it felt wrong, like I'd woken up in a dream that was already halfway to being a nightmare. My mom didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared. I remember whispering to her, not loud, just enough to make a sound. But that was enough. The figure flinched, then moved, fast. Not like a person, not really. It was lower to the ground than I expected, and the way it moved, there was no sound of footsteps. Just this rustling, like brush being pushed aside. Then the shape was gone. My mom finally turned and looked at me. I don't remember if she said anything. I just remember both of us staring at the mesh, then out into the night. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I didn't want to go back to sleep. Every shadow seemed sharper now, every noise louder. I heard a soft thud somewhere outside, like hooves on packed sand, and for a second, I didn't understand what I just heard. Then it clicked. My mom opened the tent and stepped out with a flashlight, and I followed, more out of fear of being left alone than anything else. The beam of light cut across the sand and trees, and that's when we saw them. Ponies. Wild, feral ponies, just casually making their way down the narrow path toward the beach. There were 4 of them. One had a coat so light it looked white in the moonlight, its mane long and tangled. That was what I'd seen, what we both saw. The old woman was a pony, standing close to the tent, probably trying to sniff around for food. Its long mane hanging down had looked like wiry hair. Its posture, hunched and strange in the shadows, had looked human only because my brain had filled in the blanks wrong in the dark. The campsite had been set up right across one of their trails. We didn't know it, or maybe we hadn't paid enough attention when we were setting up the tents, but that's what it was. The ponies were just following their regular path down toward the water. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They probably didn't even know we were there until they got too close. Eventually, we went back into the tent. My mom zipped it up, checked the snacks were packed away in the bins outside, and lay back down. I stayed awake longer, just listening to the ponies walking past, their soft hooves padding in the sand, the occasional snort or shake of their manes. I could still picture the shape in the window, the silhouette that had looked so much like something else. It was a long time before I fell asleep again, and even then, I kept waking up to the slightest sounds. But by morning, everything looked normal again. Just another bright, hot day on the island. The ponies were gone, probably grazing in the brush somewhere farther down. Our tent had faint hoof prints near it, soft dents in the sand like they had stopped and lingered for a while before moving on. We ate breakfast, packed up a few things, and went down to the beach. The water was cold that morning, colder than I remembered it being the day before. I didn't say anything about what happened that night, and neither did my mom, but I kept looking over at the trail, watching for movement in the brush. That night stuck with me, though, not because anything bad actually happened, but because of how real the fear had felt, even when the truth turned out to be something ordinary. It taught me how the mind fills in gaps when it doesn't have all the information. In the dark, a pony becomes a person. A shadow becomes a threat. Your own imagination can trip you up worse than anything else out there. And after that trip, we always checked where the trails were before pitching our tents. It was early summer when our troop headed out for a week at a Boy Scout camp nestled in the thick woods near a lake. This wasn't your typical campground with cabins and paved walkways. It was real backwoods stuff. You'd hear the crunch of dried leaves with every step and smell the mix of pine sap and distant smoke from the mess hall fire pit. We were used to pitching our tents right on the forest floor, but this place was different. Because the area had a reputation for flooding during heavy rain, the camp had built these elevated wooden decks for each tent spot. Each one was about a foot off the ground, just tall enough that someone could crawl under if they really wanted to, but low enough that it felt like an enclosed space. Dark, shadowy, and just a little eerie if you happened to look underneath at night. We'd arrived on a Sunday. The heat hit hard and stayed there like a weight pressing down on you. Humid, sticky, the kind of weather that makes your sleeping bag feel more like a trap than a comfort. Still, we were all buzzing with that early trip energy, setting up tents, unpacking gear, cracking jokes, and teasing the new kids who hadn't learned yet how to properly stake down a rainfly or tie a taut line hitch. I shared a tent with a kid named Marcus. He was quiet, kind of kept to himself, but I liked him. He didn't complain, and he always pulled his weight when it came to chores. The week was packed full of the usual camp activities. Merit badge classes during the day, swimming in the lake, shooting at the rifle range, long hikes through thick woods, and hours of lugging gear back and forth. By the third day, we were all exhausted, sunburned, bug-bitten, covered in dirt, and living off of camp food that ranged from okay to totally unrecognizable. Nights were the only real downtime we had, and by the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, most of us were out cold in minutes. That particular night, it had rained earlier in the evening. Not a full downpour, just enough to bring out the damp smell in the soil and make the leaves stick to your boots. The ground was slick in places, and small puddles had already formed along the dirt paths between the tents. We'd spent the better part of the evening in one of the larger tents playing cards under the light of battery-powered lanterns. The air was thick with teenage body odor, cheap bug spray, and sweat. I remember we stayed up way too late, past lights out, telling dumb jokes and dealing cards until someone noticed it was already 1 a.m. One by one, we peeled ourselves away from the game and made our way back to our own tents. By the time I hit my sleeping bag, I was completely worn out. My legs ached from the hike earlier, my eyes were heavy, and my shoulders still felt sore from carrying the canoe back from the lake. Marcus was already half asleep. I remember lying there, listening to the gentle tap of water dripping off the rainfly and the occasional rustling of raccoons poking around in the brush. Somewhere out there, frogs croaked lazily. I fell asleep fast, the kind of sleep where your mind just drops out like someone flipped a switch. Then, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, I remember because I checked my watch in the chaos that followed, everything changed. First, it was just a sound, high-pitched, shrill, cutting straight through the dense night air like a blade. A scream, not the kind you'd expect at camp, like someone messing around or pretending to be scared for a laugh. No, this was raw, terrifying, the kind of scream that makes your stomach drop and your skin crawl. A second later, I heard words that I still haven't forgotten. Help! Help! I'm under the tent. Someone's got me. I shot up. My heart immediately kicked into high gear. For a second, I thought I was dreaming or hallucinating, but then it came again, louder, more desperate. I'm under the tent. Someone's got me. I recognized the voice. It was Joe. Loudmouth Joe. Everyone in the troop knew him. He was always the first to start trouble, first to crack a joke, first to suggest we sneak out and pull some harmless prank. But this wasn't that. This was pure panic. Other tents started to rustle. Zippers opened. Whispering voices. People trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Some were too scared to move. I could hear Marcus breathing fast next to me, totally frozen. And I don't know why. Maybe it was adrenaline or maybe it was just stupidity. But I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The air outside was cold compared to the sticky heat we'd been living in, and it hit me like a slap. The ground was soft and slick beneath my boots. I swept the flashlight around the surrounding area. Joe's tent was just 2 spots over from ours, maybe 20 feet away. I aimed the beam toward it and walked fast, almost jogging. The other tents were still, heads peeking out of flaps, wide eyes reflecting the light. I reached the deck Joe's tent was on and crouched low, shining the beam underneath. My hands were shaking a little. I half expected to see, I don't know what, someone pulling him under, some wild animal, something awful. But there was nothing, just darkness and leaves and a weird stillness. Except something was off. The leaves under the deck were disturbed, messy, like something had been moving around down there, scraped up. Fresh tracks in the dirt. My brain immediately jumped to the worst case. He was pulled under. He was gone. I stood up quickly, heart racing, and burst into the tent. Joe's tent mate, Ben, I think, was sitting upright, eyes huge, completely pale. And there was Joe, sitting up too, sweating and breathing hard, but clearly not under the deck. He looked dazed, confused, like he wasn't fully awake. I just stood there for a moment, staring at both of them, breathing hard like I just run a mile. The pieces didn't make sense. Joe had screamed like he was dying, begged for help, said he was under the tent, but there he was, sitting in his sleeping bag, not a scratch on him. Eventually, things calmed down a little. The scoutmasters had come out by then, hearing the commotion. Joe looked completely out of it but was slowly starting to return to normal. He looked embarrassed, which made sense once we pieced it all together. He'd had a nightmare, a full-on, screaming, thrashing, talking in his sleep kind of nightmare. His body stayed put in the tent, but his mind, it went somewhere else entirely. In his dream, he was under the tent. In his dream, something had him, and he screamed for help so loud and so clearly, we'd all believed it. Every one of us. His tent mate had been scared out of his mind. Said he woke up to Joe screaming and couldn't even speak. Just froze. Didn't even think to wake him. And me? I was still running on adrenaline, trying to convince myself I hadn't just imagined those disturbed leaves under the deck. Later that morning, when the sun finally came up, I walked back over to Joe's tent with a couple other guys. We crouched down and checked under the deck again. This time we saw it clearly. Paw prints. Small ones. Raccoons. Probably the same ones that had knocked over our trash bags the night before because someone had forgotten to tie them off properly. The disturbed leaves had nothing to do with Joe. Nothing had dragged him. No one was out there waiting in the shadows. It was just a dream. That morning at breakfast, Joe took a lot of heat for it. Guys teased him, called him names, exaggerated the story. Some even made it sound like he'd been possessed or dragged by a bear. But most of us, especially the ones who had heard that scream firsthand, didn't joke too hard. We knew how real it had sounded, how raw and terrifying. I didn't tease him at all. I didn't say anything, actually, just kept thinking about how fast I jumped out of my tent, convinced someone had been kidnapped, how the fear had felt, thick and heavy, real in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not during ghost stories or dumb pranks or flashlight tag. This was different. The rest of the week went by like normal. Swimming, hiking, sitting around the fire, telling jokes. But something had changed for me. I'd learned how easily the line between real and imagined could blur. How fear can creep up from something as simple as a voice in the night. And how sometimes the scariest thing at camp isn't a bear or a stranger in the woods. It's the things we carry in our heads. I never forgot that scream. Even now, years later, if I'm camping and wake up in the middle of the night, I still half expect to hear it again. That raw panic, tearing through the silence. But I also remember the truth. No monsters, no kidnappers, just a scared kid lost in a nightmare, and the rest of us caught in the edge of it. That's what stuck with me the most. How something unreal could feel so real, even just for a minute. And how quickly fear spreads in the dark. When you're tired, in an unfamiliar place, with nothing but canvas between you and the world. We'd planned the camping trip for months, marking it as a much-needed escape from the grind of city life. The idea was simple. Head out to central New South Wales, find a remote patch of bush, and just relax. The forecast had been clear, 40-degree days, and we thought we'd be set for the heat, so we packed light, only the essentials. Flimsy plastic tents, a couple of sleeping bags, and no blankets because we thought, honestly, we wouldn't need them. We had no reason to suspect anything would go wrong. We arrived at the site just before noon, the heat oppressive even under the shade of the sparse trees. The land was dry and cracked, with the occasional burnt-out logs scattered around the camp area. It was the perfect spot, isolated, quiet, far from the nearest town or even any road. We set up camp, joking about how we probably overpacked for a weekend that would turn into nothing more than a couple of days of fun. The heat didn't bother us at first. We were in a good mood, thinking about what we'd do in the evenings, sitting around the campfire. That afternoon, we went for a short walk around the area. The landscape was beautiful in its own rugged way, with low scrub, trees scattered here and there, and wide, dry patches of land in between. We didn't see any other signs of life, just the occasional bird swooping low over the bushes. By the time we got back to camp, the temperature had dropped slightly, but nothing too uncomfortable. The heat was still hanging in the air, making it feel like the day was never going to end. By evening, things started to change. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped quicker than we expected. The sun sank below the horizon, and the cold bit into us. We'd planned to make a big fire to keep warm, so we all chipped in to gather as much wood as we could find. With the heat during the day, we hadn't realized just how cold it could get out here at night. When the sun was completely gone, the chill seemed to sink into our bones. The fire was roaring, a massive blaze that flickered and crackled in the night air. But despite the heat of the fire, it didn't feel like it was enough. We were all huddled around it, some of us standing, others sitting on the ground trying to keep warm. It was one of those nights where the cold was almost unbearable. We had enough wood for the night, or so we thought, but I knew we would need more if we were going to survive until morning. Around midnight, I decided to head out into the dark to find more wood. I was wrapped in a thin jacket, barely enough to stop the cold from crawling into my bones, and the light from the fire barely reached past the campsite. I took the small flashlight and made my way through the dark, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a cold glow over the land, But even with the light, it felt like the shadows went on forever. Every step I took felt like I was drifting farther away from the warmth of the fire and the safety of camp. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, though it felt like much longer, before I found a decent pile of dry branches and logs. I was about to turn back when I heard something in the distance, a rustling sound. Maybe an animal moving through the brush. I paused, listening. There was something unsettling about it, like I wasn't alone out here. But I shrugged it off, grabbed the wood, and made my way back. It wasn't until I was almost back to the campsite that I realized something was wrong. The fire was out. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. There was no sign of the others. The tents were empty. The ground around the campfire was cold, the ashes already beginning to settle. The warm glow of the fire that had been so strong when I left was now just a dark hole in the ground. I stood there for a long moment trying to piece things together. Where had they gone? Had they gone for a walk? Maybe I had taken too long to gather wood, and they had decided to head back to the vehicle or something. But that didn't make sense. The Uda was parked right there earlier, and it was the only vehicle we had. I looked around again. The cold started to seep deeper into my skin, biting through the thin layers I was wearing. I walked over to the spot where the car had been parked. Empty. No sign of the Uda, no tracks in the dirt, nothing. It was like they had just disappeared. I felt a panic start to rise in my chest. What the hell was going on? It didn't make any sense. I was alone now, in the middle of nowhere, with no fire and no shelter. The night was closing in, and the freezing temperatures were making my teeth chatter. I tried calling out, but the only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. There was no response. I walked back to the fire pit, hoping the warmth would return if I could get it going again, but the fuel had burned out long ago. The branches I had brought back with me were cold and damp. I tried starting a new fire anyway, but my fingers were numb, and I couldn't get the tinder to catch. I sat down by the pit, trying to come up with a plan, but it felt like the longer I stayed there, the more I sank into confusion and fear. Hours passed, though it felt like no time at all. The cold began to settle into my bones, and I knew I couldn't stay out there all night. I decided to walk back to the house where we'd parked our car. It wasn't far, a couple of kilometers at most. I could make it, but I wasn't sure I wanted to. The idea of walking through the dark, cold night by myself, with no idea what had happened to the others, made my heart race. But there was no other choice. I grabbed what little gear I could carry and started walking, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. What the hell had happened? Where had they gone? What had caused them to leave so suddenly? And why had the fire gone out? It was like the whole camp had just evaporated. By the time I arrived at the house, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the landscape. I was exhausted, my face flushed from the cold, and my hands stiff from the chill. I stumbled inside, half expecting to find my mates waiting for me, maybe laughing at some prank they'd played. But that wasn't the case. One of the guys had been taken to the hospital. Apparently, he had collapsed in the cold, and they'd had to drive him there in a panic. The others had gone with him to make sure he was all right. They had all left in a rush, never even thinking to wait for me or let me know what was going on. They'd assumed I had stayed behind to get wood or something. They never thought to check if I was still out there. I stood there in the doorway trying to process everything. Felt like some strange nightmare, but it was real. I had been left alone, in the middle of nowhere, in the freezing cold, with no fire and no idea where my friends had gone. I didn't feel angry. I felt empty. We'd all made the mistake of thinking we could handle anything in the bush without being fully prepared. But that night, the bush had shown us just how quickly things could go wrong. How fast the heat could turn to cold. How quickly the warmth of the fire could vanish. How suddenly you could find yourself lost. That night will stay with me for a long time, not because of any ghostly happenings or strange occurrences, but because of how close I came to disaster in the middle of nowhere. How quickly things can change, and how little we control when nature decides to remind us of our place. And when I think back on it, I realize how lucky I was that things didn't go even worse. I've always loved camping with my family. We make it a tradition to head up to the woods around Flagstaff at least once a year. It's something we all look forward to. My parents, my siblings, and me, along with our dog, Rudy. Rudy's been part of our family for as long as I can remember. He's a gentle dog, a mutt. Really, his fur's a mix of browns, blacks, and whites, and he's always been a loyal companion, especially on camping trips. He loves the outdoors. It's like his element. He's always running around, sniffing the trees, and picking up sticks to drop them at our feet like he's helping us collect firewood. It's just one of the things that makes him Rudy, and we all love it. So, that night, it was around 11 p.m., and we were sitting around the campfire. The flames were casting a warm orange glow on our faces, and the sound of crackling wood was the only noise in the air, aside from the occasional chirping of crickets. My dad was on one side of the fire, his reading glasses perched on his nose, playing a game of cribbage with my mom. My younger brother, Jake, was sitting next to me, his legs stretched out, tapping his feet to the beat of some song in his head. My sister was off to the side, scrolling through her phone for the umpteenth time that night, but she wasn't really paying attention. Rudy was lying on the ground in the middle of the circle, curled up at first, but he kept shifting and getting up, walking around the fire, sniffing the air like he was trying to figure something out. Then, out of nowhere, he suddenly got up again, his body tense and his fur standing on end. His ears perked up, and he turned his head slowly to face the dark woods behind us. He stood there, staring, growling low in his throat. I froze. My parents stopped playing their game, and my brother turned around to look. Rudy never growled, not like this. He was a friendly dog, the kind of dog who would run up to strangers just to get a scratch behind the ears. He didn't have a mean bone in his body, but this was different. This wasn't a playful bark or the usual excited panting. This was a full-on warning. It wasn't a growl aimed at us, either. No, it was directed at something in the woods. Something we couldn't see. We all stared into the woods with him, but the darkness was thick. There was nothing but trees and shadows beyond the fire's reach. The wind had died down, and there was no sound except for Rudy's low growl and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere far off. Time seemed to stretch out in that moment. Rudy didn't move an inch. He just kept staring, growling softly, his tail rigid behind him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something big. My heart started beating a little faster, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, like the shadows were hiding something. But there was nothing there. Nothing that I could see anyway. It went on like that for a good 20 minutes. Rudy never stopped staring. It wasn't like him at all. I could tell it was making my parents uneasy too. My dad kept glancing at Mom like he was trying to figure out what to do, but no one said anything. We just sat there in silence. The only sound Rudy's growls and the crackling of the fire. Finally, after what felt like forever, Rudy stopped. He didn't bark or jump up, but his growling softened. He slowly lowered himself back down to the ground, but he kept his eyes on the woods. His body was still tense, though, like he was ready to spring into action if something happened. We didn't talk about it much after that. My dad made a joke to lighten the mood, saying that maybe Rudy had just seen a squirrel or something, and we all tried to relax. We got up and put out the fire, going into our tents to get some sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Rudy had never acted like that before, and it made me uneasy. That night, I woke up to the sound of Rudy snarling. It wasn't just a growl anymore. It was a full-on snarl, deep in his throat, sharp and aggressive. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding in my chest. I listened, straining to hear. It was coming from outside. Rudy was at the edge of our campsite, near the woods again, barking and snarling like he was ready to attack whatever was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and poked my head out of the tent, careful not to make too much noise. I could see Rudy clearly in the moonlight. His hackles were raised, and he was standing there in the dark, staring into the trees again. His mouth was open in a snarl, teeth bared, and his whole body was trembling. I looked around, trying to spot anything that might explain his behavior, but the woods were quiet, too quiet. No movement, no sounds. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to go out there and check on him, but I couldn't. I was frozen. I glanced over at my parents' tent, but they were still asleep. I felt a cold sweat on my neck, and I pulled my head back inside the tent, zipping it up quickly. What was out there? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another animal, a deer or a raccoon, something that Rudy didn't like. But the way he was acting, it wasn't normal. I lay back down, my mind racing, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing those deep snarls and imagining what could be out there, watching us. The trees were too dark to see anything clearly, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move with the wind, making everything feel unnervingly alive. Finally, I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't restful. Every creak of the tent, every whisper of the wind in the trees, woke me up. The next morning, everything was still. The sun was just starting to come up, casting a pale light over the camp. Rudy was lying near the edge of the campsite, still alert but not growling anymore. His fur was still standing on end, and he looked tired, like he hadn't slept at all. I could see my parents were still a little shaken by what had happened, but they didn't mention it. We packed up camp in silence, the strange events of the night lingering in the back of our minds. We didn't know what had set Rudy off, but I had a sinking feeling that we weren't the only ones out there that night. We never figured out what Rudy was growling at. There was no sign of anything around the campsite, no broken branches, no footprints, nothing that would explain his behavior. It was like whatever it was just gone. As we drove away from the campsite that morning, Rudy sat in the back of the car, staring out the window. His tail wagged a little, but I could see the unease in his eyes. I don't know if he sensed something in the woods that we didn't, or if he just knew the woods were never as peaceful as they seemed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. Something big. Something that had been out there in the dark, just beyond the light of the fire, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was still out there. But we never went back to that spot again. We never talked about that night either. It was just one of those things that happened, and it stayed with us, lingering in the back of our minds every time we camped after that. Whatever had been in the woods that night, it had gotten away. We never found out what it was, but Rudy knew, and sometimes, when we were out camping again, I'd catch him staring off into the woods, his ears perked, his body stiff with that same tension, and I'd wonder if it was still out there, just waiting for the right moment to return. It was a few years ago now, but I can still feel the chill from that night. I went camping with my girlfriend, Emma, in the Uhori National Forest in North Carolina. We had driven up late, arriving around midnight after the sun had long disappeared, so we had to set up camp in the dark. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of humid summer night where you're never quite sure if the sweat on your skin is from the heat or just the weight of the night itself. We didn't plan on getting there so late, but the trip had taken longer than expected, and we were both eager to get the tent up and get some rest. We parked at a designated spot near the trailhead and pulled out our gear. I remember looking around, and even though it was dark, I had a strange feeling. Something about the place didn't sit right with me. It was quiet, too quiet. There wasn't a breeze, not even the rustling of leaves. It was like the forest was holding its breath. It wasn't just the silence that bothered me, though. It felt like there was something there, something watching us from the darkened woods. I shrugged it off. It was late, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. We managed to get the tent set up with a couple of flashlights and lanterns. It wasn't perfect, but we made do. I remember how the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch out toward us, their long, twisting limbs dancing in the flickering light. I couldn't shake that feeling, though. The woods were still. The only sounds were the occasional crackling of leaves beneath our feet or the distant call of some nocturnal creature I couldn't identify. Once the tent was set up, we crawled inside, trying to settle into our sleeping bags. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching, little noises that didn't quite belong. It was probably just animals, I told myself. The kind of noises the woods make when you're camping in unfamiliar territory. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't a deep sleep. My body was too tense, too on edge. I woke up at sunrise, the first light creeping through the thin fabric of the tent, and I was still feeling that unease. We packed up our stuff and set out to hike the nearby trails. The sun was up now, but the air still felt thick, like the forest was holding on to the remnants of the night. We decided to hike a trail that would take us up the mountain, a moderately difficult hike that would give us a great view of the surrounding area. As we ascended, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was constant, like the hairs on the back of my neck were perpetually standing up. It was subtle, like a shadow lurking just behind me, but it never quite went away. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I didn't see anything, but it didn't help. The woods felt alive in a way that made me uneasy. It wasn't a normal kind of wilderness alive. It was as if the forest itself was aware of us, watching our every move. We hiked for hours, taking breaks now and then, but I couldn't relax. Even when we were sitting down on a log, taking in the view, I kept scanning the tree line, looking for movement, for something that didn't belong. Emma didn't seem to notice it as much, but I could tell she was picking up on my unease. Every so often, she would glance at me and ask if I was okay. I'd tell her it was just the hike getting to me, but the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a few hours of hiking, we decided to head back to camp. We made our way down the mountain, taking the main trail that led back to our campsite. We were tired, but we felt good. We had been out in the woods for most of the day, and we were looking forward to relaxing by the fire and eating our freeze-dried meals. As we descended, though, something happened that I couldn't ignore. A loud noise echoed from behind us, like rocks tumbling down the side of the mountain. It wasn't a huge crash, but it was enough to make both of us stop in our tracks. We looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of any animal, no movement in the trees, just the silent, waiting woods. I tried to shake it off, telling Emma it was just a rock slide or something, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up again. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. We made it back to camp without incident, but that feeling didn't go away. It clung to me like a heavy fog, lingering in the back of my mind. I tried to distract myself by starting a fire. We sat down around it, heating up our meals. I had lasagna, she had beef stew, nothing fancy, but it was hot and filling. We ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. After we finished, we cleaned up, and then we decided to light up a joint and just relax, letting the weed kick in. For a while, things were okay. We laughed, we joked, the tension started to fade a little, but the unease never really left me. Then it happened. The footsteps. At first, it was quiet, almost like a faint shuffle, but it was getting closer. It was so subtle that I thought I might be imagining it. But then, there it was again. Slow, uneven footsteps, like someone stumbling around the campsite. It sounded like someone was walking, but they weren't walking right. The steps were off, as if they couldn't quite keep their balance, dragging their feet like they were drunk or injured. Emma looked at me, her face pale, and I could tell she had heard it too. We both froze, listening intently. The footsteps circled around the campsite, coming closer and then moving away, only to return again. It wasn't a normal sound. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't even sound like a person walking normally. It was staggered and erratic, like something or someone was lost, confused, or worse. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my 12-gauge shotgun, loaded one in the chamber, and unzipped the tent. I ran out into the darkness, the flashlight in my hand cutting a narrow beam through the blackness. I swung it around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. There was nothing. The woods were empty. I checked the perimeter of the campsite, every shadow, every tree, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of any animal or person. I felt a cold sweat creeping down my spine. I didn't know what it was, but something wasn't right. I turned to head back to the tent when I heard Emma's voice. "Brandon!" I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't just the voice that was odd, it was the way she said it. It was off, like something was distorting it. The way her voice echoed in the still air, it sounded almost like static, like it was coming from a speaker. She kept repeating my name, but the sound was warped, unnatural, like a bad signal. I ran back to the tent, my heart racing. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I opened the door. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky. I was half expecting her to tell me she heard something too, but when I looked at her, she had this confused look on her face. "What do you mean? I'm just sitting here," she said, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't want to scare her, so I dropped the subject, but the unease in me didn't go away. I lay awake for hours, staring at the tent's ceiling, listening to the silence, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. The footsteps had stopped, but the dread hadn't. Then, around 2 a.m., just as I finally started to doze off, the footsteps came back. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. They were getting closer. I grabbed the shotgun again, waking Emma up. I looked at her, and before I could even say anything, her voice came from outside the tent. "Hey Brandon, come look at this." I felt the blood drain from my face. I moved in front of her, pointing the gun at the opening of the tent. There was nothing outside, not a sound, not a movement. It was dead silent. No crickets, no birds, nothing. It was as though time had stopped. Then the smell hit me. It was sickening, a putrid odor that made my stomach churn. It was like rotting flesh, the smell of decay. It crept into the tent, filling the air around us. And the footsteps grew louder, running all around the campsite, moving in every direction, as if whatever it was circling us, closing in. I couldn't take it anymore. We stayed awake, our hearts pounding, for the rest of the night. Neither of us dared to fall asleep. The footsteps eventually stopped, but the tension never left. As soon as the sun came up, we packed everything up, quickly and quietly. We didn't talk about it. There was nothing to say. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. We left the Uhori National Forest as fast as we could, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. All I know is that something was watching us, something that didn't belong in the woods. I don't care what it was, whether it was a bear, some strange person, or something else entirely, but it wasn't normal. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the footsteps, the smell, and that distorted voice. I haven't been back to Uhori since. I don't think I ever will. I've been on a lot of fishing trips, but this one stands out in a way that still gives me chills, even now, over a year later. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a calm night out with my brother, fishing on a quiet bridge deep inside a nature reserve. It was supposed to be peaceful, just the two of us, some fishing rods, the quiet rustle of trees, the sound of water running below, and the stillness of the night. Nothing more, but that night, the air was thick with something else. It had been a while since I'd gone night fishing. It was one of those traditions we'd started when we were younger, spending hours by the water in the dark, just the sound of our lines hitting the water and the occasional ripple. The kind of night where the world felt smaller, and nothing could really go wrong. But this was different. We weren't even out there for an hour before things started to feel off. The night had been unusually dark. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of trees, leaving the night unervingly black, like a void swallowing the entire landscape. We were about an hour into our fishing with no real luck. The quiet was starting to get to me. My brother seemed unbothered, pulling on his line every now and then, trying to get the attention of any fish that might be nearby. I should have noticed it sooner, the absence of sound. The world felt like it was holding its breath, even though we were out in the middle of nowhere. The only sounds were the faint trickles of the river, the occasional chirp of a distant insect, and our own movements. I figured it was just the kind of night that made everything seem a little more intense, a little more alive. It was my brother who noticed it first. He stopped, his rod frozen in his hands, listening. His face was hard to read, like he was trying to make sense of something in the dark. I heard it too, rustling. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the bridge, faint at first but growing louder. Probably deer, I said, shrugging it off. Deer were common around here, right? They liked to roam the woods at night, munching on whatever they could find. My brother didn't seem convinced, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he went back to fiddling with his tackle box. I tried to ignore it, but the rustling continued, and it wasn't like any deer I'd heard before. There was a certain sharpness to it, like something was moving through the brush with purpose, and it didn't sound like it was moving away. It was getting closer. Maybe it's just a couple of deer or something, I said again, my voice a little less confident, but I wasn't really sure anymore. The sound was definitely closer, and as we sat there trying to fish, the rustling seemed to follow us. Every time I spoke, it would get louder, like something was reacting to the sound of our voices. But when we fell silent, it would quiet down again, almost as if it was waiting for us to make noise. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I wasn't the type to get scared easily. The woods were full of wildlife and we were out here all the time, but this felt different. It didn't feel like a typical animal. It was something else, something that knew we were here, something that was moving with a deliberate intent. I'm gonna check something, I said, trying to reassure myself more than anything. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, but it only illuminated the trees and the ground beneath us. I moved the light over the bushes, the rocks, and the trees, but I didn't see anything, just shadows, twisting and stretching in the beam of light. Nothing, I muttered to my brother, but I didn't feel relieved. If anything, I felt more unsettled. The rustling continued, closer now, and I could hear faint breaking of twigs and the dragging of something heavy along the ground. We sat there for a few more minutes, both of us silent, listening. The rustling was so close now that I could almost feel it. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there, but I couldn't ignore it either. It was like the whole world had stopped, except for this one noise, this one thing out in the dark, and it was waiting for us to acknowledge it. My brother reached for his rod again, his hands shaking a little, but then froze. His eyes met mine, wide with something I couldn't place. He was looking past me towards the woods. My heart skipped a beat, and then, through the thick air, I heard it. A whisper, distant, faint, but undeniably clear. There's only two of them. My blood turned cold. I couldn't speak. The voice, if you could even call it that, was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't a shout or even a yell. It was soft, hushed, like a hiss that barely made it through the trees. But there was something wrong with it. It didn't sound human. My brother's face went pale. He didn't say anything, but we didn't need words. I didn't need him to tell me what he was thinking, because I knew. We both knew. I didn't think, I didn't ask questions. I didn't hesitate. Without a word, I grabbed my stuff, shoved my phone in my pocket, and started running. My heart was pounding in my chest, my feet hitting the ground hard as I sprinted toward the car. My brother was right behind me, his footsteps barely audible in the chaos of my own breath and the pounding of my heart. We didn't stop, didn't look back. I knew there was no point in looking. Whatever was in those woods, whatever had whispered to us, it wasn't something I wanted to see. We reached the car in what felt like record time. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my breath ragged. But finally, I unlocked the door, and we both jumped inside. I slammed the car into drive, my foot pressing the gas without a second thought. As we sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the blackness, I could feel my adrenaline slowly starting to ebb away, but my mind was still racing. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind us. We didn't speak for the entire drive home. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car. I could feel the weight of the night pressing on me, and it wasn't until we got back to the house that I started to breathe again. I'm not sure what we heard out there or who or what whispered to us. It wasn't a bear or a deer or anything I could explain. The only thing I'm sure of is that we weren't alone on that bridge. And whatever it was watching us. I don't think I'll ever truly understand what happened that night, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to that bridge again. Some things are better left in the dark. And now, every time I think back to that night, I can still hear it. That whisper, so faint yet so clear, and it still makes my skin crawl. Last summer, I decided to go on a hiking and camping trip by myself after my friends bailed on me. They had all flaked out on the idea, deciding they'd rather do other things, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had always wanted to do a solo trip to really challenge myself, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. I've been an outdoors enthusiast for a while, but this would be my first time doing a solo hike and camping overnight in the wild. I was nervous, sure, but I was also excited. I started my hike in the morning, hoping to cover the distance in one long push. My goal was to get to a spot by the lake that I'd found on a map, a remote spot that felt like the perfect place to disconnect from everything. It was about 8 hours of hiking, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I had packed light and was determined to enjoy the experience. What I didn't count on was how much more difficult things would become when I forgot a couple of crucial things at home. For one, I didn't bring enough water. I had packed a couple of bottles, figuring I could refill along the way, but I hadn't anticipated how hot it would get or how long it would take me to reach the camp. The trail was longer than I thought, and by the time I reached the lake, I was already feeling the effects of dehydration. My throat was dry, my lips cracked, and my energy was low. On top of that, I realized I had left my water purification tablets at home, something I never thought I'd forget. By the time I got to the lake, I was desperate for water. The first thing I did was set up camp. I knew I wouldn't be able to get any rest until I had enough water to drink. I knew that there was a fire interdiction in the area, which meant no open flames or fires, but I didn't have much choice. I was already on the verge of exhaustion, and without water, I wouldn't make it through the night. I had to take the risk. I wandered around the area looking for dry wood to gather. It felt like an eternity just to find enough to start a fire. I didn't have the most experience with fire making, especially under the stress of dehydration, but I knew I had to try. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, and I could feel the weight of the night closing in. After a couple of hours, I finally managed to get a fire going, though it wasn't as big as I wanted. I used it to boil water from the lake, hoping the heat would make it safe enough to drink. The process was slow, but I didn't have much of a choice. I couldn't afford to waste any water. By the time I had enough, the sun was fully down, and the world around me was dark and quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. I drank as much as I could, though it wasn't easy. My stomach was a bit unsettled, and my body was shaking from the long hike and dehydration. But I knew I had to hydrate before anything else. Once I drank enough water, I figured it was time to sleep. I had to pack up my things and walk a little ways to my tent, which was set up in the woods. The moment I stood up, I felt the full weight of exhaustion in my bones. Every step felt like a chore. My muscles screamed at me to stop, but I kept going. As I turned away from the fire, I took a deep breath, ready to put the events of the day behind me. I was too tired to think about anything else, too tired to care about the strange noises that echoed through the trees, or the cold that started to seep in as night fell. That's when I saw the eyes. At first, it was just a reflection in the dim light of my headlamp, two glowing spots about 20 feet away from me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But no, they were definitely real. Two yellow eyes staring at me, unmoving, waiting. My heart dropped into my stomach. I wasn't ready for this. I was alone. I was dehydrated. And there was something or someone in the woods with me. I froze. For a moment, I thought about running, but I knew I didn't have the strength for it. I didn't have a weapon, no way to defend myself. I thought about the bear safety guidelines I had read back at home, all the things I was supposed to do if I encountered a bear. But I was in no condition to follow a scripted set of instructions. My mind was scrambling, and then, instinctively, I started talking. I don't know why. Maybe it was just a last-ditch effort to stay calm. Maybe it was because I didn't know what else to do. But I started talking to the bear, as if it were some sort of old friend. "You've made a bad decision being out here," I said, my voice shaky. "Just go away. You don't want to mess with me." It wasn't exactly the most logical or effective thing to say, but it was all I could think of in the moment. I wasn't sure if it would even work, but I couldn't stand there in silence any longer. The bear didn't immediately react. For what felt like forever, it just stared at me, the eyes glowing in the darkness. I didn't move, and it didn't move either. We were both caught in that moment, neither one of us sure of what the other would do next. But then, after what seemed like a small eternity, the bear finally broke the stare. It turned around, slowly, deliberately, and began to walk away. As it moved, it glanced over its shoulder a few times to make sure I hadn't followed. I stayed absolutely still, watching as it disappeared into the woods, its dark shape fading into the trees. After a while, I couldn't even hear its footsteps anymore. It had gone, and I was left standing there, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was relieved, but another part of me felt completely rattled. How could something like that just happen, and I didn't even have a weapon or a proper defense? What if I hadn't acted like I did? What if I hadn't spoken to it at all? I didn't know, and I didn't want to think about it anymore. I turned around and stumbled back to my tent as fast as I could. My body felt like it was on autopilot, moving only because I told it to. I didn't even take the time to look over my shoulder to check if the bear was following me. I just wanted to get to safety, to get inside the warmth of my tent. I could hear the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig, but I didn't care. I just kept walking. When I got to the tent, I closed the flap quickly, breathing heavily. I didn't even bother to take off my shoes or my jacket. I just crawled into my sleeping bag and pulled it tight around me. It took a while for my heart to slow down. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My head was spinning and my muscles ached. But as I lay there in the dark, the events of the day began to catch up with me. I thought about the hike, about how difficult it had been. I thought about how close I had come to running out of water, about how I had almost gotten myself in a worse situation by not being prepared. But despite everything, I managed to survive. I managed to deal with the bear. Somehow I fell asleep, despite the lingering fear in my mind. The adrenaline eventually wore off, and my exhaustion took over. It was a strange kind of sleep, not peaceful, but not entirely restless either. I was physically spent, my body shutting down as I lay there in the darkness of my tent, hearing the occasional rustle of the wind outside. When I woke up the next morning, the sun had already risen, casting light across the lake and the woods. I felt groggy, but there was a sense of relief in the air, like the world had started over and I had survived another day. I wasn't sure if the bear was still out there, or if it had gone on its way, but I wasn't going to think about it too much. I had my water now, and I was ready to pack up and head back. I had made it through the night. The bear didn't bother me again, and I managed to get my water, even though the night was full of surprises. Looking back, it felt like one of the most extreme adventures I'd ever had. There were moments when I thought I wouldn't make it, but I did. I had to trust myself, my instincts, and in the end, I learned something about survival and about my own resilience. I packed up my tent, made a quick breakfast, and started the long hike back home, feeling both exhausted and accomplished. The bear was gone, and the woods felt peaceful again. Despite the challenges, I made it through, and that was enough for me. It was a routine backpacking trip for the Girl Scouts, something I'd done dozens of times before. As the backpacking specialist, it was my responsibility to lead the group safely through the wilderness, teach the girls about the outdoors, and ensure they learned valuable survival skills. This particular group had about 10 girls, all between the ages of 12 and 14, and 2 adult counselors who were there to assist but not to really lead the trip. I was in charge. We had set up camp in a secluded spot, tucked into a valley between 2 ridges. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness you only get when you're far from any signs of civilization. The trees around us were dense, the ground soft with fallen pine needles, and the air smelled fresh, earthy, with a slight hint of wetness from a distant rain earlier that morning. The kind of weather you don't mind as long as the sun is out, which it was, thankfully. I had just finished setting up my own tent, making sure everything was squared away. The girls were settling into their tents, preparing their gear for the night, and the counselors, who had never been much help in previous trips, were sitting outside their tent, reading magazines. It didn't seem right, but I shrugged it off. They were supposed to watch the girls, but it was rare that they actually needed to intervene unless there was an emergency. After a while, I realized I had to take a bathroom break. It wasn't just a quick trip to the nearest tree. It was going to take a while. I grabbed my trowel, told the girls I'd be back soon, and set off for a more remote spot in the woods where I could dig a hole in peace. As I hiked a little ways up the slope, I heard the first gunshot. At first, it didn't strike me as odd. I had heard gunshots before in these parts, especially during hunting season. People around here were used to it. But then there was another shot, and another. It sounded like it was getting closer. By the time I had finished and buried my business, the shots had stopped. But the quiet that followed felt wrong. It wasn't the normal silence you'd expect in the woods. It was too still. I could feel my heart begin to race. I started heading back to camp, not thinking much of it at first. But as I neared the edge of the clearing, I heard voices. The girls were in full-on panic mode. I sprinted the last 100 yards, breaking through the trees to find the girls gathered near their tents, wide-eyed and frantic. They were talking over each other. Some were crying, some were shaking. "They're gonna shoot us," one of the girls wailed. "They're hunting us," another shouted. I immediately tried to calm them down. I told them that the shots were from hunters, and that hunters were just doing their thing, hunting deer, not people. I told them that we were safe here and that they didn't need to worry. But I could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't believe me. Not completely, anyway. One of the girls suggested they all change into camouflage clothes to blend in, and before I could stop it, the rest of them were scrambling through their packs, trying to find anything brown or green to wear. The more they did, the more it seemed to fuel their panic. I paused for a moment, gathering myself. What should I do next? I couldn't let them go on like this, terrified for their lives over something that wasn't even a threat. I took a deep breath, then spoke again. This time I was calm and firm. I told them that wearing bright colors like red or orange would actually be better if we had to make ourselves known to the hunters, but that really everything was fine. They were safe. Took a little while, but slowly the girls began to calm down. Their breathing slowed, and the tears stopped. They sat down by their tents, looking uncertain, but at least not panicked anymore. That's when I decided to find the counselors. They needed to know what was going on and help me reassure the girls. I started walking toward their tent, but as I neared it, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. I could hear the rustling of paper inside, the soft sound of pages turning. When I peeked into the tent, I froze. The two counselors were sitting inside, heads bent, completely absorbed in their magazines. They hadn't even looked up when I approached. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice even, but I could feel my frustration building. "What's going on here? The girls are freaking out." One of the counselors looked up slowly, as if I had just interrupted the most important part of their reading. The other didn't even seem to notice. "They're just kids. They'll be fine," the first counselor said, shrugging. "You're in charge, right? You deal with it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The girls were out there, terrified, thinking they were about to be shot, and the adults in charge of them were sitting in their tent, reading magazines as if everything was fine. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "You're supposed to be looking after them," I reminded them. "When the gunshots started, I was the one who took off. You were supposed to be the ones to calm them down while I dealt with it." One counselor just shrugged again, not meeting my eyes. "You know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've never worked with anyone as useless as you two." I gave specific instructions. I expected you to follow them. Instead, you ignored the girls' panic and stayed in here like nothing was happening. They didn't even apologize. They didn't even seem to understand why I was upset. I could feel my anger simmering beneath the surface, but I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I walked back to the girls and made sure they were okay, making sure they felt safe, even if they still didn't fully understand what had happened. I let them know we were going to stay right where we were, that they weren't in any danger. As the evening wore on, the threat of hunters seemed to disappear. The sounds of the forest returned to normal, and the night went on as usual. I kept a close eye on the girls, staying nearby until they fell asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. When we made it back to camp after the trip, I immediately filed a full report. I couldn't let what had happened go unnoticed. The counselors' lack of action had been beyond irresponsible. They had failed in their most basic responsibility, keeping the kids safe. I knew that if I didn't speak up, someone else might end up in the same situation. Those two counselors were never assigned to a backpacking trip again, nor were they trusted with any group of kids for the rest of the summer. The camp director made sure to have a long talk with them about what had gone wrong, but I'm not sure they ever fully understood the gravity of the situation. I didn't have to work with them again, but I heard through the grapevine that they weren't exactly great at their other jobs either. It made me wonder why they'd even been hired in the first place. As for me, I took my lessons from the trip and made sure to be even more diligent the next time I was out with a group. I wasn't about to let something like this happen again. But that night, after the girls had finally calmed down and the hunters were long gone, I sat outside by myself for a while. The moon was high, casting a soft light over the camp. I thought about the irresponsibility I'd witnessed, the fear that had gripped the girls, and how easily it could have gone much worse if I hadn't been there to step in. I let out a deep breath, grateful that I had been able to handle it. But I also knew that I'd never be able to trust those counselors again. And in the silence of the night, I realized something else, that I was ready to do whatever it took to protect the kids in my charge, even if that meant going up against the very people who were supposed to be helping me. The sun had barely risen when we gathered in front of my house, ready for our annual camping trip. It was the 1st of May, the day we always marked for our tradition, and this year was no different. We'd been planning it for weeks, each of us contributing to the usual haul of food, drinks, and camping gear. As always, a few of us stopped by the convenience store to grab some beer for the road. The plan was simple: head to the same camping spot we'd been to a dozen times, deep in the woods, set up camp, and drink until the sun went down. It was the kind of trip where we could just let loose, have fun, and forget about everything else for a while. By 5 a.m., everyone was packed into the car, bags full of stuff, and our spirits were high. It was still chilly outside, and the sun hadn't quite come up yet, but it didn't matter. We were used to the early mornings, the long drive, and the excitement of reaching our destination. It was tradition, and no matter what, we kept it. We drove through the countryside, the roads lined with the kind of greenery that always made me feel at ease. We passed the town and headed further out, deeper into the forest. When we finally reached the campsite, it was still relatively quiet. A few other cars were parked nearby, people unloading their gear and setting up their own spots. But we didn't pay them much attention. Everyone else was there for the same thing, enjoying the outdoors and having a good time. The sun was starting to warm the air as we set up our tents. We got a fire going, the smoke rising into the clear sky, and cracked open the first beers of the day. As usual, the whole group was in high spirits, laughing, joking, and just enjoying the moment. The spot we picked was nestled in the woods, just far enough from the other campers to feel like we had some privacy. But even so, we could still hear faint music in the distance from the other side of the campsite. It was nothing unusual, just some people playing music to keep themselves entertained, like we were. Hours passed. The day turned into late afternoon, and we found ourselves with empty cans scattered around the campfire. The music from the other campers had been playing pretty steadily throughout the day, but as the sun started to dip behind the trees around 7 or 8 p.m., the music suddenly stopped. At first, we thought nothing of it. We figured the people near us were just winding down for the night, maybe getting some sleep. It wasn't uncommon for people to pack up and leave on the night of May 1st, since most of them were only there for the day. But we were staying for the whole weekend. Around that time, one of my friends, Jake, said he was going to go over and ask if anyone had a lighter. We'd forgotten to bring one, and he thought it wouldn't hurt to check with the nearby campers. He wandered off in the direction of where the music had been, but when he came back a few minutes later, he looked kind of surprised. "They're gone," he said, shaking his head. "I went over there, and no one's around. Everything's packed up. They must have left early." We all stood there for a moment trying to process what he said. It didn't make sense. Normally, people stuck around at least until the 2nd of May, and we'd never seen anyone leave that early. But we shrugged it off. Maybe they just had somewhere else to be. Jake found a lighter and we got the fire going again. It was starting to get dark now, the kind of dark where the trees almost swallowed up the light, and the air had that cool, crisp edge to it. We cracked open more beers and kept talking, trying not to think too much about the weirdness of the situation. The night carried on as normal, the sound of our laughter and conversation filling the space around us. But around 10 p.m., something changed. We heard it at first, a faint sound off in the distance, something like a giggle, the high-pitched laughter of girls playing in the woods. It wasn't unusual to hear people messing around in the dark, but the way it sounded made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound like normal laughter. It was distorted, like something was off, and it wasn't just the laughter. We started hearing footsteps, quick, light steps, like someone was running through the forest. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. It didn't make sense. There was no one around, and even if there had been, no one would have been running like that in the woods. Felt wrong. "What the hell was that?" someone asked. "It's probably just some drunk people screwing around," Jake said, trying to brush it off. "Let's just keep drinking." We passed the beers around again, the laughter coming easier now as we tried to ignore the strange sounds. But the noises didn't stop. The running footsteps grew closer, and the laughter kept echoing through the trees, each time a little more distant, but still there. We'd drunk enough to feel pretty buzzed by now, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Something didn't sit right about it. At this point, everyone was on edge, trying to act casual but feeling uneasy. The air around us felt thicker, like the forest had become a different place altogether. Then, we heard something even worse. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming towards us from the trees. They weren't fast or light like the running from earlier. These were slow, deliberate steps, like someone or something was walking toward us. Everyone immediately tensed up. We grabbed anything we could find, shovels, knives, sticks, and we prepared ourselves. We didn't know what we were going to face, but we weren't going to be caught off guard. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. We waited, hearts pounding in our chests, the crackling fire the only sound in the air. I swear, for a moment the whole forest went quiet. There was no sound of wind, no rustling of leaves, just absolute silence. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen. But then, the silence was broken by a snap of a twig somewhere to our left. We all jumped, our eyes darting to the darkness. We stood there for a long time, listening. The footsteps didn't return. It wasn't until we started to settle down again that we heard them once more, coming from the edge of the camp. They were getting closer. We all stood up, ready to fight whatever was out there. But again, nothing came. The footsteps stopped just out of view, and no one emerged. We kept quiet, waiting in the dark. We knew there was something out there, but whatever it was staying just far enough away that we couldn't see it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps, the laughter, everything. It all went quiet. By the time we decided to try to get some sleep, we were all exhausted, but the tension in the air didn't let up. We lay in our tents, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the only thing that kept us from thinking too much about what had happened. Still, no one slept well that night. Every little noise had us on edge. A branch breaking, a distant snap of a twig. It all made us jump. When the morning came, we were all awake before the sun even rose. We were too afraid to stay in the tents any longer, and we all piled out, looking around. But there was no sign of anyone. No one had been there. The campsite was as quiet as it had been when we first arrived, and the tracks we thought we'd seen in the ground were gone. We looked for signs of whoever or whatever had been around us, but there was nothing. No footprints, no traces, just the quiet of the forest. As we packed up to leave, none of us said much. We all knew what we had experienced, and though we couldn't explain it, we were all shaken. That night, whatever had been in the woods with us wasn't human, and we were lucky that it didn't come any closer. To this day, we've never talked about it much. Maybe we were all just drunk, maybe we heard things that weren't there, but something happened that night, and none of us will ever forget it. Even now, I can't help but wonder if we were just a little too close to something we shouldn't have been. I went hiking in the Smokies with a few friends over Halloween weekend a few years ago. It was an odd weekend to pick for a hike, but we had planned it for a while. The weather had been looking promising, and we were all excited to spend a few days in the mountains. It was late October, so we knew it would be cold, but we were prepared for it. None of us had any real concern about the snowstorm that rolled in the night before we set out. The forecast had hinted at some cold weather, but no one thought much of it. When we woke up that morning to a thick blanket of snow, it only added to the adventure. It wasn't unusual for the Smokies to get an early season snowstorm, and it looked beautiful in the morning light, like a winter wonderland. It was clear that things were going to be tougher than expected, but we were ready for the challenge. We weren't expecting to meet anyone on the trail. After all, it was pretty early in the season. The storm had kept many people away, and we figured we'd have the mountains mostly to ourselves. But as we made our way to the campsite, something felt off. The temperature had dropped quickly overnight, and there was a sharp chill in the air. It wasn't quite freezing, but you could feel the bite in your lungs with every breath. We knew we had to make good time, so we kept our pace steady, trudging through the snow-covered trail with our gear weighed down by the cold. When we reached the site we planned to camp at, we saw something strange. At first, it seemed like an ordinary scene. Snow covering the ground, trees dusted with white, and the sounds of nature muffled by the storm. But in the distance, there was a tent already set up. A bright blue tent, sticking out against the whiteness of the landscape, and a campfire ring nearby. It didn't seem like anyone was there, but we thought maybe they had just gone for a quick hike. It was unusual, but not totally unheard of. People often leave their tents and gear behind to explore, especially on shorter trips. We set up our camp and went about our usual routine. The snow was deep in spots, making it harder to get things done. After setting up the tent, we gathered firewood and got a small fire going to keep warm. The smoke from the fire swirled up into the cold air, and the smell of burning wood was comforting. But something about that other campsite lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop glancing over at it, trying to see if there was any movement, any sign of life. The tent flaps were open and I could see inside. It was completely still, as if no one had been there for a while. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the silence felt unnerving. The snow continued to fall, soft and heavy, covering everything in sight. But still, nobody showed up at the other campsite. I kept expecting to hear voices or see someone walking over from that direction, but nothing. I figured maybe they'd gotten a late start and would arrive in the evening, so we didn't think much of it. But the longer the day went on, the more unsettled I became. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped even further. We were all huddled around the fire, wrapping ourselves in jackets and blankets. But even with the fire crackling, it wasn't enough to shake the sense of something being wrong. I looked over at the other campsite again. Still no sign of life. The open tent door hung loose in the wind, and I could just make out a few things inside, like a bag of food and a pair of Crocs, their plastic soles poking out in the snow. It felt wrong, like someone had just left in a hurry. The bag of food inside the tent looked untouched, and the shoes, they looked as if they'd been abandoned in the middle of something, left behind for no apparent reason. Snow had blown through the tent and was piled up inside, blanketing everything in a cold, damp layer. Whoever had set up the tent wasn't coming back. But why? We spent the night in our own tents, huddled together for warmth. The cold was biting, and the wind howled through the trees, making the whole place feel even more isolated. The sound of the storm outside and the crackle of our fire were the only noises keeping us company. But even with all the distractions, I couldn't shake the thought of that abandoned tent. It gnawed at me, like there was something I was missing. The next morning, We packed up our stuff and prepared to head out. The snow had only gotten deeper overnight, and the trail was more difficult to navigate. As we were breaking down our camp, we glanced over at the other campsite once more. Nothing had changed. The tent was still there, still open, still covered in snow. It felt strange to leave without ever seeing anyone. We decided to take a closer look before heading out. I walked over to the site, crunching through the fresh snow with every step. The cold air stung my face, and the wind had picked up again, sending the snow swirling in the air. I approached the tent cautiously, half expecting someone to jump out or some explanation to hit me in the face. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The tent was as I'd left it the night before. The door was still open, the food still inside, and the crock still lying on the floor, half buried in the snow. But what really stood out was the distinct lack of any footprints. Not a single print around the tent. There was no sign of anyone having come back during the night, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It made no sense. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything had gone wrong. But still, something about it felt entirely off. I checked the ground again, scanning for any tracks, anything that could explain why the camp was left behind. That's when I noticed something: fresh bear tracks. They were about 100 yards from where the tent had been set up, just off to the side in the snow. The tracks were unmistakable, large, deep impressions in the snow, clearly from a bear. The tracks were fresh, too. They hadn't been there for long. My heart skipped a beat. I had heard stories about bears in the Smokies, of course, but seeing the tracks so close was unsettling. It wasn't out of the question that someone might have encountered a bear while setting up their camp. Maybe the people who had been there had heard the bear approaching, gotten scared, and dropped everything to get out of there fast. It would explain the abandoned food, the shoes left behind, the open tent. But why hadn't they come back for their things? We didn't have an answer, but the bear tracks told us something important. Whoever had been there must have fled in a hurry. There was no way they just left in the middle of a snowstorm without a good reason. The tracks led off into the woods, disappearing into the trees, but there were no other signs of what had happened to the people. We didn't want to stick around and find out, so we packed up our stuff and started the hike back out, moving quickly. The rest of the hike was quiet. We were all a little on edge, the strange encounter weighing on us as we moved through the snow. There were no more bear tracks, and the snow was still falling steadily. As we made our way down the trail, the snow-covered landscape stretched out in front of us, a quiet, eerie reminder of how wild and untamed the Smokies could be. But despite the beauty of it all, I couldn't shake the image of that abandoned campsite, the crocs sitting in the snow, and the bear tracks leading off into the woods. We never found out who those people were or what happened to them. My guess is they saw the bear while setting up, dropped everything in a panic, and took off into the night. Maybe they didn't want to take any chances, or maybe the bear had gotten too close for comfort. It could have been something as simple as a scare that made them leave everything behind. But that uncertainty is what sticks with me to this day. The trail was quiet as we walked out, the storm still swirling around us. We had no other encounters, no strange signs, and no further signs of wildlife. It was a relief to get back to the car and head home, but the memory of that campsite haunted me for a long time after. Every time I go back to the Smokies, I think of that day, of the empty tent, and the unanswered questions. It's a reminder that sometimes the mountains don't give up their secrets easily. About 20 years ago, a group of my buddies and I made the trip up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all in the name of bow hunting for bear. We were looking for adventure, but what we got was something much darker and more unsettling than we had bargained for. It was late fall, and the UP is known for its dense forests, steep hills, and the ever-present, almost oppressive quiet that surrounds you out there. It's the kind of place that feels isolated, where the world seems to fall away as soon as you leave the main highway and head into the woods. We weren't entirely unfamiliar with the area. We had all been hunting before, but this was different. Something about it just didn't sit right from the start. The base of our operation was set near a small, nearly abandoned town at the edge of the Keweenaw Peninsula. I remember the first time we rolled into town. It was one of those places that seemed like it had been frozen in time, stuck somewhere in the 50s or 60s. It wasn't just the buildings, it was the air. Everything about it felt like the town had been abandoned overnight. There were old homes with glass still in the windows, faded rugs on the floor, appliances left behind as if their owners just grabbed what they could and left. The whole place had this eerie, decaying vibe to it. It was like stepping into a forgotten world. There was a particular building on a hill at the edge of the town that caught our attention. It looked like it had been some sort of old copper mine or maybe a mill. The place had seen better days, but what stuck out to us was a huge hole in the ground. We couldn't see the bottom of it. Whenever we dropped a rock down there, it took what felt like an eternity before it splashed into the water at the bottom. There was no railing, no warning signs, nothing to keep people from accidentally falling in. It was just a gaping, dark hole in the earth. It felt unnatural, like the town itself had swallowed it up, hiding something it didn't want anyone to find. We set up our camp about half a mile from the ghost town. None of us were comfortable staying in one of the old houses. It was one thing to hunt in the woods, but staying in a place like that, it was just too fucking creepy. So we found a spot in a clearing by a small stream, away from the decaying remnants of the town, and set up camp. We had everything we needed: tents, coolers, firewood, and a sense of quiet excitement. But from the moment we got there, something just didn't feel right. We spent the next couple of days hunting, setting up blinds, bait piles, and trying to find the perfect spot for the hunt. Everything felt a little off though. There was this thick silence in the woods, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant call of a bird. But mostly it was quiet, too quiet if you ask me. On the second evening, one of the guys came back to camp looking shaken. He said he'd had a weird experience on his way back to camp, something that sounded like a bear stalking him. He described hearing small branches snapping and leaves rustling as though something was following him. But whenever he stopped to listen, it would stop too. It wasn't just one noise, though. It was a pattern, like something was testing him, making sure he didn't know it was there. He was certain it wasn't a bear cub or a normal deer, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. We all knew about black bears in the area. They're typically shy, but if a bear is old or sick, it could become dangerous. The thought that one might be following us, sizing us up as potential prey, was unsettling. A bear can be fast when it wants to be, and it doesn't take much to be caught off guard. That night, we decided to go out in pairs. It seemed like the safest option. If a bear decided to attack, it would be much less likely to target two people at once. By the fourth day, one of the guys got lucky and shot a bear. It was about 200 pounds, a decent size for Michigan, but this one was healthy, strong, and well-fed. We figured that meant the stalking bear was just a fluke, nothing to worry about. But something still felt off. It wasn't over yet. On the last day, we got up before the crack of dawn, just like we had every other day, and headed out to our blinds. My partner and I had been sitting for a couple of hours when we heard a branch snap in the distance. We both froze, instinctively scanning the area, but the brush was too thick to see anything. We stayed alert, our minds in that hyper-aware state that you fall into when you know something is wrong but you can't quite put your finger on it. We sat for a while longer, listening for any other signs of movement, but nothing came. After a while, we decided it was time to head back. That's when everything changed. My partner stood up, and the air around us seemed to shift. A gunshot rang out, sharp and clear in the otherwise silent woods. It came from the same direction we had heard the snap of the branch earlier. I'm not sure if we both instinctively hit the ground or if it was just the sudden shock of it, but we were low, crouching in the bushes, completely exposed. A second noise followed the gunshot, a twig snapping 2 feet from my partner's head. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What the hell? The shot had sounded like a small caliber, maybe a .22, and while that wasn't exactly a big threat, it still could kill you just as easily. We both knew that, but it didn't make the situation any less terrifying. We called out, shouting that we were human, not game, but there was no response. Nothing. Just the echo of the shot and then silence. It was one of those moments where your mind starts to race with 1,000 possibilities. We couldn't see the shooter, but he had a clear shot at us, and we had nothing to return fire with, just bows and arrows, which weren't going to do much against someone with a gun. We sat there in the bushes, listening to the sounds of the forest around us, trying to come up with a plan. What the hell were we supposed to do? We couldn't just stay here forever. We couldn't risk getting hit by another shot either. My partner, who had been in the Marine Corps, kept saying how much worse the situation was than anything he'd faced in the service. At least when he was in combat, he had a weapon. Finally, I made the decision to stand up and make a break for it. If we were going to get out of there, it had to be now. But the second I stood up, it happened again. Bang! Snap! A twig broke just feet from my head. That was it. We were being hunted. Whoever was out there was toying with us, playing a game. So we sat back down. If they wanted us to stay low, we would stay low. We had no other choice. The day passed in a haze of tension, with the silence broken only by occasional rustling in the underbrush and the distant sound of yelling. At one point, I thought I heard someone shouting from far off, but it didn't make sense. The sound was faint and distorted, like it was coming from a great distance. Then, finally, we heard something we recognized, our buddies' voices calling out to us. We yelled back, and they came running through the trees. When we got together, we told them everything, about the gunshots, the stalking, the whole messed up situation. When we made it back to camp, we found the coolers had been opened and emptied, backpacks were gone, and a whole tent was missing, along with sleeping bags and some of the cooking equipment. It was like someone had just taken what they could carry and left the rest. But the cars were untouched, nothing wrong with them at all. It didn't make sense. We needed to get out of there and figure out what to do. We decided to drive to Jake's bar, a place down the logging roads that was known for being a local landmark. Jake was an interesting guy. He had a cougar named Fancy, though calling her a pet was a bit of a stretch. Fancy was wild, and Jake always had bandages on his arms from her claws. The locals all knew the story, and I guess that was just part of the charm of living up there. Jake agreed that it was time to call the state police. We called them, and they told us to meet them at Jake's the next morning. We spent the night in a cabin in Twin Lakes, a little shaken up but mostly just wanting answers. The next morning, four troopers and 4 DNR officers showed up at Jake's, ready to investigate. We all piled into their trucks, and they took us back to our camp. We showed them the camp, explained what had happened, and asked about Pauline, the name we had heard tied to the town. Maybe someone was still living out there, and they were just trying to scare us off. The cops did a thorough search of the area. They checked the woods, the town, and our camp. They found absolutely nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone being around. Just empty, deserted buildings and quiet woods. They asked us how much longer we were planning to stay, and we told them we weren't staying anymore. We were heading out as soon as we could. The lead cop told us that we could pack up and leave. They'd keep an eye on the area, but they didn't find anything unusual. We tried calling back in the months that followed, but nothing ever came of it. No answers, no follow-up. It just seemed like the whole thing was forgotten, buried under the weight of time and distance. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched the entire time we were out there. Whether it was the local residents or something else, I'll never know for sure. But the memory of that day, the tension, the feeling of being hunted, has stuck with me all these years. Pauline or not, that place still feels wrong. It always will. We'd been paddling for hours, our arms sore and stiff from the steady push against the Missinab's flowing water. It wasn't the hardest river to navigate, but in the heat of a summer afternoon, with the sun beating down and the relentless swarm of mosquitoes in the air, it felt like a constant battle. We tried to stay ahead of them with bug spray, but they'd find any little spot we missed, around the collar of our shirts, the back of our knees, under our hats. It was so bad that even just talking meant we'd swallow a few, and we spent most of the time cursing under our breaths, swatting at them like they were some sort of personal vendetta. When the sky began to darken and we started looking for a place to camp, it felt like the first break we'd gotten all day. The river had grown narrower, the trees on either side thicker. We could hear the occasional splash of a fish jumping, the eerie hum of distant birds that we couldn't identify. The sounds of the river rushing over rocks grew louder as we came around a bend, and that's when we saw it. A small island, an esker, rising out of the water. The air had changed, too. The buzzing of mosquitoes hadn't stopped completely, but the breeze seemed to carry the scent of something fresher, something cleaner, away from us. "Perfect," Dave said, his voice hoarse from the constant swatting. "No mosquitoes, no bugs, just water and rocks." I nodded, already pulling on the paddle to steer us toward the island. I wasn't sure why the breeze worked in our favor here, but I wasn't going to question it. It was hard enough to find a spot on this damn river where the bugs didn't try to drain us dry, let alone one where we could sit outside for once and not feel like a walking buffet. We landed on the island with little trouble, the canoe scraping lightly against the rocks. The esker was small, just enough room for our 3 tents, the fire pit, and a patch of ground to spread out a tarp if we needed more space. It was mostly made of small pebbles and large stones, smooth and weathered by the river's current, with a few scraggly trees scattered about. A small patch of dry earth near the water's edge would work as the fire pit, so we set up camp there. The breeze continued to keep the mosquitoes at bay, and for the first time that day, I felt like we could actually relax. As we pitched the tents, the usual routine kicked in, setting up camp, hauling out the food bags, unpacking the gear. The sky had already started to turn a dusky purple by the time we finished, and the first stars began to poke through the thinning clouds overhead. The mosquitoes still hung in the air, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been on the river. "Hey, let's just sit out here tonight. The breeze is nice, and it's actually tolerable," Tim said, sitting down on a rock near the fire pit. He stretched out his legs, his face looking as relieved as mine. We all agreed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we sat around the campfire without the constant threat of bugs crawling all over us. We didn't say much at first, just the quiet sounds of the river, the occasional snap of a log in the fire, and the cool air brushing past us. I leaned back on my arms, staring at the stars. It felt good to be here, away from the chaos of the real world, away from the constant hum of our busy lives. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe one of my friends walking around. But as I lay there listening, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was the sound of footsteps, crunching footsteps, like someone walking on loose rocks. My heart rate picked up as I tried to steady my breathing. I opened my eyes and glanced around the tent, seeing the faint outlines of Tim and Dave, both still asleep. The moonlight filtering through the fabric of the tent cast long shadows, making the inside look like an eerie, dim world. I listened closer. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The first time I heard it, it was near the back of the tent. The second time, it was closer to the front. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't like they were trying to sneak around. It felt calculated. It was like someone was checking the perimeter. My pulse hammered in my ears as I tried to stay as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps came closer again, moving around the entire tent. I couldn't see anything from where I was lying, but I could hear them. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, I heard a dull clink, a metallic sound, sharp and distinct. It was the sound of something being dropped onto the rocks, almost deliberately. My stomach churned. What the hell was that? The footsteps stopped for what felt like an eternity. There was no movement, no noise. It was as if everything had frozen in time. I couldn't even hear the wind anymore, and the river's rush seemed to fade into the background. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the pounding of my heart. I waited, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to jump up, yell out, and wake Tim and Dave, but I didn't dare move. It could be nothing, some animal or other camper, though I couldn't understand why they'd be moving like that, so close to our camp without any warning. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally started moving again. Slowly, deliberately, they moved away from the tent, getting fainter with each step until they disappeared into the night. My body stayed frozen for a few more minutes, But the silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps themselves. The air around me felt off, heavy. Finally, I couldn't stay still any longer. I pulled the sleeping bag off and slipped quietly out of the tent, making sure not to wake my friends. The cool night air hit me immediately, and I stepped onto the rocky ground, moving carefully so as not to make a sound. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the first thing I saw was the hatchet. It was lying right in front of the entrance to the tent, perfectly positioned, as if it had been placed there. I froze in my tracks. The hatchet wasn't ours. We hadn't brought one with us, and I knew for a fact that none of us had left it out. I crouched down, my fingers hovering over the steel handle. The blade was sharp, and there were no marks on it. No blood, no obvious signs of use. But its presence was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the edges of the island, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No footprints in the gravel. No sign of anyone having been near the campfire. It was as if whoever had been out there had simply vanished. I went back to the tent, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but I didn't wake Tim and Dave. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I wanted to hear their thoughts on what had happened, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen or what I'd heard. Whoever had been out there was close, too close. The next morning, I told them what had happened, but none of us really had any answers. We packed up in silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Even as we loaded the canoes back onto the river, the hatchet was still lying there, right where I'd found it, and none of us dared to touch it. We didn't even speak about it after that. We just rowed away, the sound of the river's current louder than our thoughts. But I'll never forget the crunch of those footsteps in the night, the metallic clink that echoed in the darkness. And I'll never understand why the hatchet was left behind. There's a part of me that still wonders if whoever came that night was watching us from a distance, just waiting for the right moment. But I'll never know. All I can do is remember and keep my eyes open the next time I head into the wild. Because sometimes things aren't as quiet as they seem, and sometimes they're just waiting for you to let your guard down. It was a quiet kind of summer, the kind where the days blend together in a mix of heat and stillness, and the woods seem almost too peaceful to disturb. Most of the time, when I go out into the trees, it's on my own land. We've got 40 acres, some fields, a long creek that snakes through the middle, and woods thick enough to make you feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere, even though home isn't that far. That kind of space can give you a strange comfort. You get used to the rhythm of the land, the way the wind moves through the trees, how the birds fall silent before a storm, or how the deer bed down in the tall grass if it's going to be hot. It's familiar. It's mine. I've spent most of my life exploring those woods, climbing trees, building little shelters, digging around the creek, just being a kid. As I got older, that didn't really change. The only difference was I started noticing things more. Small things like tracks in the mud, or a certain smell that didn't fit, or the way the frogs would all stop croaking at once. Still, nothing bad ever happened. I always felt safe there. One summer afternoon, maybe I was around 12 or 13, my friend came over. It was hot, but not unbearable. We decided to head down to the creek, which was tucked into a lower part of the woods where the trees kept the sun from beating down too hard. The water was only ankle deep in most spots that time of year, just enough to splash around in and cool off. We spent hours down there, kicking water at each other, lifting rocks to find crawdads, yelling to hear our voices echo down the channel. There wasn't anything serious going on, just two kids enjoying a summer day. We were down in the bend where the water curves in tight between two steep banks. That part's our favorite because it stays shaded all day and the trees kind of close in over the top, so it feels like a tunnel. We just climbed up onto one of the big rocks that juts out over the water when we heard it. A low, deep rumble, then the sudden angry roar of a four-wheeler engine. Sounded close, too close, and it was moving fast. At first, I thought maybe it was my dad or one of my uncles, but they don't drive like that. This wasn't just someone heading out for a calm ride. It was aggressive, like they were flooring it, tearing through the woods without a care. The sound was bouncing around, echoing off the trees, so it was hard to tell where it was coming from exactly, but it was getting louder by the second. We didn't even have time to talk about it. Instinct kicked in and we bolted for cover. Just up from the creek was a massive pile of old trees that had come down in a storm the year before. Some were still rooted, just tipped over with their roots sticking up like walls. Others had fallen and tangled together, forming a kind of natural shelter. We dove into a gap underneath a few trunks and ducked down as low as we could, trying not to breathe too loud. The engine roared past us not 10 seconds later. Even with all the noise, I caught a glimpse of the guy. He was older than us, maybe in his late 20s, and he looked like he meant business. I don't know if he was military or just some kind of gun nut, but he had at least 5 guns strapped to him. One on his back, another across his chest, and a few on his legs. It wasn't hunting season, and besides, we were on my land. He had no business being there, tearing through my woods like he owned the place. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All I could feel was fear, pure animal fear. We were kids. We weren't supposed to be seeing stuff like that. For all we knew, he was looking for someone, or something. We stayed hidden long after the engine faded away. We didn't move until everything was quiet again. Just the chirp of birds and the gentle splash of water down the creek. When we finally crawled out, covered in dirt and bark and leaves, we didn't say anything. We just headed back to the house, keeping to the trees as much as we could in case the guy came back. He never did, at least not that we saw, but the feeling stuck with me for a while, that hollow, anxious pressure in my chest that wouldn't go away. It was the first time the woods didn't feel totally safe. A couple years later, I had another moment like that. This time, it was with 2 friends, and we'd gone out to the far field that borders the back section of our woods. That field's wide and open, surrounded on 3 sides by trees. It's a great spot to watch the sunset or set up a little campfire. I'd just gotten a puppy a few weeks earlier, a little mutt with floppy ears and way too much energy. I brought him along that day so he could run around and get used to the land. It was mid-afternoon, clear sky, sun beating down hard. We were laughing about something, just making our way across the field toward the tree line, when the puppy started acting weird. I had him in my arms, since the grass gets kind of tall out there, but suddenly he started squirming like crazy and let out this high-pitched yelp that startled all 3 of us. Before I could react, he wriggled free and took off, full speed, straight into the woods we were heading toward. We all froze for a second. The way he ran, it wasn't playful or excited. It was like he was scared, like he was running towards something safe or away from something dangerous. I didn't have time to think it through. I just yelled for the others and took off after him, crashing down the hill that slopes into the forest. At the bottom of the hill, the air gets cooler, and the trees close in tight. The underbrush is thick in some spots, but my dog had already made a beeline toward a clearing. I followed, brushing through the branches, until I spotted him. He was just standing there now, tail low, ears pinned back. But he wasn't looking at us, he was staring at something ahead. I slowed down and stepped up next to him. That's when I saw it. In the clearing, half hidden under a layer of fallen leaves and vines, was the skeleton. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was huge, stretched out across the ground like something out of a museum. The bones were bleached white in the sun, but parts of it still had bits of skin or fur hanging on. The smell hit us a second later, rotten and wet, the kind of stink that clings to your clothes. We all covered our noses, but we didn't move. We couldn't. The rib cage was enormous. I mean, really huge, each rib as thick as my wrist, arching up and over in a way that looked more like the frame of a boat than an animal. You could have fit all 3 of us inside it if we sat close together. The spine stretched out behind it, long and winding, leading to a thick tail that curved like a question mark. It almost looked like a lion's tail, but thicker, with bone segments that didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. Then there was the skull. It was big, wide jaw, thick teeth. Predator skull, no question about it. The eye sockets were huge and deep, and the snout was long, almost like a wolf's but heavier. Whatever this thing was, it had been built for killing. We just stood there, staring. None of us wanted to get closer, but we couldn't look away either. I kept glancing at the trees around us, half expecting something else to come charging out. But the forest was quiet, too quiet. Eventually, we backed away and climbed back up the hill. The puppy stayed close, ears still flat. When we reached the field again, we didn't talk for a while. We just walked back to the house, slow and quiet. Later that day, I took out my old digital camera and went back to get pictures. I wanted to show someone, anyone, because I couldn't make sense of what we'd seen. Over the next week or two, I asked 2 science teachers, a few local farmers, even a vet. Nobody could say what kind of animal it was. They gave guesses, sure, some kind of cow, maybe a wild pig, possibly a big dog that had mutated somehow, but nothing matched. Not the skull, not the ribs, not the tail. And this was Indiana. We don't have lions. We don't have anything with bones that size roaming the woods. The pictures are gone now. That old camera stopped working a long time ago, and the SD card got misplaced. I've searched for it more times than I can count, but it's just gone. All that's left is what I remember. And I remember everything. I remember how the puppy sensed it first, how he panicked in my arms like something invisible had passed over us. I remember the way the bones looked in the sunlight, stretched out like the thing had died mid-run. I remember how none of the trees near the skeleton had any damage, like the animal hadn't been attacked by something bigger, but just died there. I went back to the spot a few months later on my own. The bones were still there, but they'd been disturbed. Drag marks in the dirt, some of the ribs scattered. I couldn't tell if it had been animals picking at the remains or something else. Eventually, everything was gone. Whether someone found it and took it, or if it just sank into the forest floor over time, I'll never know. These days, I still go out into the woods. I still walk the same paths, still sit by the creek, still hike through that same field. But there's a part of me that's always listening now, always paying attention. I still love the land. It's mine. It's home. But I don't think I'll ever feel as invincible as I did before that summer. Nothing truly terrible ever happened. No one got hurt. But there's something unsettling about realizing you don't understand your own backyard. That something can die just beyond the hill, leave behind a skeleton the size of a horse, and no one can tell you why. And even now, sometimes I'll walk past that part of the woods and get this strange feeling, like I'm not the only one watching, like the land remembers too. I must have been around 10 or 11 when we went camping near that old pond. My brother, Ben, and I had always found the place interesting, but there was one spot that we always stayed away from, the burned down house. It wasn't far from the pond, just up a small hill, and you could barely make out the remnants of the house through the trees. It was a sad, blackened skeleton of what had once been a home. The roof had caved in, and the walls were charred to the point where you couldn't even tell what they had been made of. The air always smelled faintly of smoke, even though the fire had clearly happened years ago. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, but it still held a sort of eerie pull on us. Ben and I used to talk about it in hushed tones, daring each other to go closer. We would imagine what it had been like before it burned down, who had lived there, and what could have happened to them. Every time we passed it, I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The house stood there, like a dark sentinel, keeping its secrets, daring anyone to come close enough to discover them. That particular afternoon, as we sat by the pond, the sky overcast and the air thick with humidity, I remember Ben turning to me with that mischievous glint in his eye. He asked if I thought we should finally go inside the house. It was one of those moments where everything felt like it might just line up perfectly, and I couldn't back down from the challenge. I agreed, of course, and we stood up, brushing the dirt and leaves from our pants. We made our way up the hill toward the house, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. The fence surrounding the house was old, the wood weathered and cracked, the metal wire sagging in places. Ben had always been better at climbing than I was, and with his help, I managed to scale the fence without much trouble. As we landed on the other side, we stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the ruined house. There was something heavy in the air, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. The front door was long gone, only a twisted frame remained, and the windows were shattered, the glass long since reduced to tiny shards. As we stepped cautiously inside, Our feet crunched on the debris that littered the floor. It was dark, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The soot on the walls made everything look a sickly shade of gray. I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be here. But Ben, fearless as always, pushed on, eager to explore every corner. We stepped further into what had once been the living room. The floor creaked ominously beneath us, and I wondered how much longer the house would stand before it completely gave way. The smell of smoke was overpowering, and there was something else, too. A faint odor, like something musty or rotten, mixed with the lingering traces of fire. The walls were scarred with soot, and what had once been furniture was now little more than blackened frames and charred remnants. There was nothing left of the house that looked remotely livable. It was as if the fire had taken everything with it, leaving only the wreckage behind. I felt a slight tremor in my chest, my heartbeat picking up as I wondered what had happened here. Who had lived in this house? Had they been caught in the fire? Had anyone died here? The thought was unsettling, but Ben didn't seem to care. He was already rifling through the remnants of what used to be a shelf, pulling out a pile of old, singed books. I stayed by the doorway, watching as he flipped through the pages of one, clearly fascinated by it. He pulled out something odd, a small picture book, its cover worn and tattered. The edges were singed, but the book itself seemed mostly intact. He handed it to me, and I couldn't help but feel an uneasy curiosity. It looked out of place in the rubble of the house, almost like it didn't belong there at all. The title on the front was strange: Cursed Objects and Strange Coincidences. I raised an eyebrow but flipped it open anyway, even though something inside me was telling me to put it down. The pages were yellowed with age, and the pictures inside were weirdly detailed. Drawings of strange, cursed objects, like a mirror that showed your future death and a car that seemed to bring misfortune to anyone who owned it. The stories inside were just as bizarre, recounting oddities like the sinking of the Titanic and the bizarre fate of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car. It was like a collection of spooky, clickbait-like stories, the kind you would see on an internet article today, but this one had been published like an almanac in the 1980s. We read through it, flipping from one strange tale to the next, but as we neared the end, things started to get a bit more uncomfortable. There was a final entry, an odd one. It was a story about the book itself, a strange coincidence involving the editor of the publication. The editor claimed that the book was cursed, that anyone who read it would experience something unusual, maybe even bad luck. At the time, it seemed like a cheesy ending, a cheap way to wrap up the book with a supposed warning. But in that burned-out house, with the charred walls surrounding us, the words felt heavier. The idea that we might be cursed for reading it in that very place, where something bad had clearly happened, felt real. I remember feeling a sense of dread, not because I believed in curses, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that we had done something wrong by being there, by opening that book. When we finally decided to leave, the house didn't feel like it had before. It was as if the very air had changed, thickened, and the weight of what we had just done was pressing down on us. We hurried back to the fence, both of us a little too eager to get out of there. We didn't speak much on the way down the hill, our minds consumed with what we had just read. But as we crossed the fence and made our way back to the pond, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something, like the house had been waiting for us to find that book. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I kept thinking about the book, about the warnings in it, about the strange coincidences. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to convince myself it was all just a story, just something to make the reader feel uneasy. But the more I tried not to think about it, the more it gnawed at me. Was I cursed? Would something bad happen to me, to Ben, to anyone? I couldn't know for sure, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't get rid of it. We left the campsite the next day, and I thought I would forget about the house, about the book. But every now and then, I would catch myself thinking about it, wondering if there was any truth to what we had read. I convinced myself that I hadn't done anything wrong, that it was just a book. But every time something small went wrong, whether it was losing a game, getting a bad grade, or something strange happening at school, I couldn't help but think that maybe the curse was real, even if I didn't believe in curses. It's been years now, and I haven't thought about that house or that book for a long time. I've tried to forget, tried to push it to the back of my mind. But today, as I sat down and thought about that camping trip, the memory came rushing back, and I couldn't help but think about the warning in the book. I'm still alive, so I guess I wasn't cursed. But I'm not sure I'll ever fully shake the feeling that something about that house, about that book, still lingers with me. It's a small thing, something I could dismiss, but every now and then, I find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'm still carrying the weight of that old story with me. Maybe it's just a memory, or maybe it's something more. Either way, I know I'll never be able to forget it, no matter how hard I try. We'd been planning this trip for months. The idea of camping on Round Island, off the northern Michigan coast, had a certain draw to it that we couldn't ignore. We weren't exactly tent camping, but it was close enough. We'd rented a sailboat to spend the weekend on the water and the island. It wasn't just the usual camping, though. It was a mix of adventure and the thrill of getting away from it all. No better way to do that than on a boat, right? Getting to Round Island wasn't as simple as just driving there. We had to take a ferry from the mainland, which added a little extra excitement to the trip. It felt like we were heading to some hidden spot, completely cut off from the world. The ferry ride was smooth, the wind in our faces, and the water was as clear as glass. But when we were about to dock, the park ranger gave us a briefing that quickly shifted the mood. He was polite but firm as he looked over at our group. We were the only ones on board. "Just a heads up," he said, voice cutting through the soft hum of the engine. "There's been increased bear activity on the island. If you see one, don't run. Get off your bike, hold it in front of you, and make yourself look bigger. They usually try to bluff." That didn't sit well with me. I'd heard stories of bears charging people and getting aggressive, but hearing it from the ranger made it feel all too real. I glanced at the others, and we all nodded, silently agreeing to stick together and be cautious. The ferry docked, and we unloaded our bikes onto the island. As soon as we hit solid ground, the nerves started creeping in, but we pushed them back and began riding inland. We hadn't gone far, maybe a mile, when we saw her, a huge mama bear and her cub, just standing there in the middle of the path. My heart immediately leapt into my throat. We had to react fast. I remembered the ranger's instructions. Don't panic, don't run. I hopped off my bike, holding it in front of me like a shield, trying to make myself look bigger. It felt like everything around me went silent except for my own breathing. The bear just stood there for a moment, staring us down. My legs felt like they were turning to jelly. And then she did something that almost made me pass out. She turned away, like she was going to leave. I felt a surge of relief, but then, almost as if she'd read my mind, she spun around and charged at us. It was like something out of a nightmare. She was moving fast, her heavy paws pounding the dirt, and for a split second, I thought we were done for. But then, just as suddenly as she charged, she stopped, only about 5 yards away, and stared us down. We stood frozen, still holding our bikes in front of us. After what felt like an eternity, she turned back around, snatched her cub, and disappeared into the woods. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't realize how much I had been holding my breath until it was over. Felt like a close call, too close, but we didn't waste time dwelling on it. The ranger had said bears were common on the island, and we had just had our first run-in with one. We needed to stay sharp. We continued on, a little more cautious but determined not to let it ruin the trip. We rode deeper into the island, the trees closing in around us, their long shadows stretching as the sun climbed higher. After a while, we stopped at a small picnic area near the beach. It was peaceful, quiet. We spread out our food and took a break, trying to shake off the nerves from the encounter. But the peace didn't last long. As we finished up our meal, we spotted movement in the distance. A male bear, casually circling the edges of the campground. It was a good 50 yards away, but that was too close for comfort. We quickly packed up our things and got back on our bikes, ready to move on. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as we pedaled away, we took a narrow 2-track trail that wound through the forest. I was riding near the edge of the group, my tires crunching on the gravel path. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and trees that blocked out most of the light. It was quiet, but every so often, I thought I could hear a rustle off to the side, too soft to be the wind. I shook it off, but the tension from the bear encounter was still there, hanging in the air like an unspoken fear. And then it happened. I glanced down into a small ditch on the right side of the trail. My stomach dropped. There, not more than 2 or 3 feet away, was a massive bear, sitting casually in the ditch, munching on berries. Its eyes were locked on me, and I could feel the weight of its gaze even as it slowly swiped its paw through the bushes, gathering more berries to stuff in its mouth. The size of it hit me like a freight train. It was huge, easily the size of a small car. My veins felt like ice, and I could feel the cold sweat starting to bead on my forehead. Couldn't make a sound. I didn't want to make a move, didn't want to risk startling it. The bear didn't seem to care about us. It was just doing its thing, unfazed by our presence. I pedaled faster, trying not to look directly at it. The rest of the group continued ahead, oblivious to what I had just seen. I wasn't about to stop them, though. I didn't want to risk any more attention. As we got further down the trail, I realized just how badly I wanted to get off the island. All this bear activity was freaking me out. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, but the thought of that bear so close, staring up at me from the ditch, kept replaying in my mind. We were surrounded by wilderness, and we had no idea what else might be lurking in those woods. 5 minutes later, I spoke up. We need to get off this island. It wasn't just the bear encounters. It was the whole atmosphere, the tension, the constant feeling of being watched. The place was beautiful, sure, but I didn't feel safe anymore. Not with those bears roaming around. We saw another cub on our way out, but nothing compared to the encounters we had earlier. The cub was farther off, just a small shadow darting into the trees, not even bothering us. But it was enough to remind me of what we'd just gone through. The bears were everywhere, and while I knew it was their home, it felt like we were intruders, uncomfortably close to their territory. By the time we made it back to the ferry dock, I was relieved to be leaving. The sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the water. We loaded our bikes back onto the ferry, still shaken but grateful to be heading home. The trip had been full of adventure, but it was a reminder of how wild and unpredictable nature could be. Bears weren't the only danger out there, but they sure felt like the most immediate one. As the ferry made its way back to the mainland, the island grew smaller behind us, swallowed by the fading light. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. That island, those bears, and that sense of being watched. It all stayed with me long after we left. I couldn't shake the feeling that, had we made the wrong move at any point, things might have gone very differently. But that was the reality of the wild, wasn't it? You had to respect it, even when it felt like the danger was just around the corner. The bears had let us go, but they had made their presence known, reminding us that we were just visitors in their world. And next time, if there was a next time, I wasn't sure I'd be so quick to push forward. The island had left its mark on me, and I wasn't sure I'd be ready for another encounter like that anytime soon. We had rented this cabin out in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, deep in the woods, with nothing but miles of thick forest surrounding us. It was the perfect spot for a getaway. We'd driven up from the city, just looking for some peace and quiet, a break from everything. The cabin itself was tucked away, isolated from the rest of the world. It was small but charming, with a rustic, almost eerie feel to it. No other houses were in sight. Just trees, thick and dense as far as you could see. You couldn't even hear traffic or the usual hum of civilization. It was quiet, too quiet. We were a group of about 8 friends and family who had all decided to escape for a long weekend. The idea was to kick back, enjoy the hot tub, do some hiking during the day, and just relax. There was no real agenda, just us out in the woods, away from everything. The first night was exactly what we had hoped for. We cooked some steaks on the grill, enjoyed a few beers, and then moved out back to the hot tub to wind down. It was one of those clear nights where the stars were so bright you felt like you could reach out and touch them. The air was cool, but the hot tub made it bearable, and we all just sat there, talking and laughing. The night was calm, and everything felt perfect. But at about 2 a.m., that perfect night took a turn. At first, we thought we were hearing things, just the normal sounds of the woods. Rustling leaves, maybe a branch snapping, the occasional animal moving through the trees. But then we started hearing something that didn't make sense. It wasn't just random noises or animal sounds. There was this low, rhythmic sound, almost like chanting. It was distant, but the sound was unmistakable. It was like at least 30 people were chanting something, some sort of chant that repeated over and over again. The voices were so clear, but distant enough that they seemed to echo across the woods. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as it continued. It didn't stop, didn't waver, just a steady chant in the distance, clear as day. I glanced over at the others in the hot tub, but no one said anything at first. We all just stared at each other, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. We were all thinking the same thing. Where could this sound possibly be coming from? There was nothing around for miles. The sound carried, and it wasn't just a one-off noise. It went on for what felt like an eternity. The chanting didn't fade. It was as if a group of people, at least 30, maybe more, were sitting somewhere in the woods, saying the same thing over and over. We couldn't make out what they were saying, but the cadence was the same. A rhythmic pattern that didn't let up. My heart started racing. No one spoke for a while. We just sat there, listening, trying to make sense of it. The noise, though faint in the distance, seemed to grow louder in a strange way. Not in volume, but in how close it felt, like it was getting under your skin, making the night feel even more oppressive than it already was. There was something about it, something unsettling that I couldn't put into words. After what felt like an hour, one of us finally broke the silence. "What is that? Do you hear that?" We all nodded, our minds scrambling for an explanation. Was it a cult? Some strange group out in the woods doing God knows what? Maybe a ritual of some kind? The thought alone was enough to send chills down my spine. We decided to head inside. Not that we felt any safer in the house, but at least it was somewhere enclosed, somewhere we could lock ourselves in. We made sure every door and window was shut tight. The cabin had this old feel to it, like it was built 100 years ago, and it creaked with every step you took. But that night, it felt more like a coffin than a retreat. We didn't talk much after we locked ourselves in. The chanting didn't stop, and we could hear it clearly even through the thick walls of the cabin. It wasn't just in our heads. It was real, and it was out there somewhere in the woods. I have to admit, I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound outside made my heart skip a beat. I kept imagining someone or something standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. Morning came, and we all kind of brushed it off like it was a bad dream, but we knew deep down we weren't going to forget it anytime soon. We told the others about the chanting, but they just laughed. "You guys are crazy," they said. "You probably just heard an animal or something." They joked about it, said it was probably a group of drunken hillbillies out there messing with us. We didn't want to sound paranoid, but I could tell from the looks on everyone's faces that no one was really buying that explanation. That night, we decided to take a more active approach. We were going to see if we could catch whatever it was on tape. So we pulled out an old camera, one of those bulky ones from the late 90s, and we left it recording outside while we hung out on the porch. The plan was simple. Let it record, and if it happened again, we would have proof. We stayed up late, but this time we made sure to watch the clock. And sure enough, right around 2 a.m., it started again. The chanting, that same rhythmic, unsettling chant, echoing from deep in the woods. This time, we weren't going to let it slip by. We grabbed the camera and went outside to capture it. The sound was just as loud as the night before, but it was still too far to make out exactly what was being said. We listened for a while, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from, but it was hopeless. It seemed to come from all directions, like it was being broadcast across the forest. We let the camera run for as long as we could, but it was hard to capture it clearly. The sound was so faint on the recording that you had to strain to hear it. When we finally stopped the recording, we didn't know what to think. We had captured something, but it was barely audible. The next day, we called the cabin owner to ask about it. We wanted to know if he'd ever heard anything like it before. His response was casual, almost too casual. "There are weird people out there," he said, as if that was explanation enough. We asked him what he meant, but he just repeated himself, "Weird people out there." The conversation ended awkwardly after that. It was the weirdest response. Did he know something we didn't? Was he trying to brush us off? Or did he really know about something strange happening in those woods? The way he said it made me uneasy. Felt like there was more to the story, but he wasn't going to tell us. That night, we tried to prepare ourselves, but we were all on edge. The chanting came again, exactly at 2 a.m., just like clockwork. It wasn't a one-time thing. Every night we were there, it happened. Every night it lasted for at least an hour. We all heard it. It was undeniable. There was no mistaking it for anything else. By the last night, we were so used to it that we almost didn't react when it started again. The fear had dulled, but it was still creepy as hell. We were glad when the trip ended, but part of me wanted to know what it was. Was it some strange local tradition? A group of people doing something in the woods that they didn't want anyone to know about? Or was it just some freaky coincidence? Something we'd never be able to explain? We never got answers. When we left, we packed up our things and drove out of those woods without looking back. Even though we never heard anything like it again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't want to be found. The cabin owner's words still haunt me. Weird people out there. What did he know? What was going on in those woods? I don't think I'll ever truly understand, but I'll never forget the sound of those voices, chanting in the night.